Hey there, come in, get comfortable, and let the rest of the day just fall away. Tonight we're not just telling one small story. We're going back further than we've ever gone before, all the way to the very beginning of what makes you well you. Here's something almost every one of us was taught as kids, and it turns out to be wrong. We were told humans evolved from monkeys. Some ape somewhere just stood up one day and became a person. It's a tidy little picture. It's also almost entirely false. The truth is stranger older and honestly a lot more humbling. Somewhere around 7 million years ago in a forest that no longer exists, there lived a creature that was not a monkey, not a chimpanzee, and not a human. It was something else entirely, and every single person you've ever loved is descended from it. Tonight we go looking for that creature, and for the strange, sometimes messy story of how science finally found the courage to believe in it. Before we step into the forest together, I want to ask a small favour. If stories like this one feel like company on a quiet night, a like or a follow helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a tap. If you've got a comment in you, I would honestly love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something rather wonderful about knowing. This same story is drifting through so many different rooms in so many different time zones all at once. And if you ever feel like sticking around for the long haul, there's a way to support the channel directly too. Never anything you need to do, only ever there if you want it. Now dim the lights if you can, maybe crack a window or turn on a fan for that soft steady hum in the background. Get settled in, let's begin. Picture a forest. Not the kind you'd recognise from a nature documentary, thick with silence and shadow, but alive, endlessly alive with sound. Birds you have never heard of calling from branches that no longer exist. The air is warm and damp heavy with the smell of wet leaves and ripening fruit, and sunlight breaks through the canopy in shifting gold patches that slide across the forest floor. Somewhere in the canopy, moving without much hurry, is a creature about the size of a chimpanzee. She knuckle walks along a thick limb, pausing to strip bark with her teeth. Her face is not quite ape, not quite human. It's both, and it's neither. She has no name because there was no one there to give her one, but she is in a very real sense your relative. Not your ancestor exactly, more like a great-great-aunt many, many generations removed. Somewhere around the time she lived, her family split into two paths. One path eventually became every chimpanzee and bonobo alive today. The other path became every human being who has ever lived. You, me, everyone. Here's the number that makes this real. When scientists compare human genetic material to that of a chimpanzee letter, by letter the two turn out to be about 98.8% identical. Not 90%, not 80, 98.8. That figure was first calculated in 1975 by two researchers named Mary Claire King and Alan Wilson working out of Berkeley, California. Dr. King was still finishing her graduate studies at the time. What she and Wilson found was almost too strange to publish. Two species that looked so different, that built such different ways of being, were assembled from genetic blueprints that were almost the same book, just with a few pages rewritten. So here's the myth we need to gently set down. Humans did not evolve from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are not our ancestors, and we are not theirs. Think of it less like a ladder with humans standing at the very top climbing up and out of the jungle, and more like two branches growing outward from the very same trunk. The chimpanzee sitting in a forest sanctuary today has been evolving, changing, adapting for exactly as many millions of years as you have. Neither one of you is finished. Neither one of you is the final draft. But if that's true, who is standing at the base of that trunk? What did the last shared ancestor of humans and chimpanzees actually look like? Did it walk upright even a little? Did it spend its days in the trees or down on the ground? Here's the strange part nobody knows for certain. The fossil record from exactly that window of time deep in Africa 7 or so million years back is almost painfully thin. A handful of bone fragments, a few teeth. Enough to argue over for decades, not nearly enough to settle the argument outright. Some researchers picture something similar to a modern chimpanzee knuckle-walking through dense forest. Others picture something already a little more upright testing out life at the forest's edge. Maybe it moved mostly like a chimpanzee. Maybe it was already something stranger caught in between. Or maybe, and this is the quietest possibility of all, it looked like nothing alive on Earth today, a creature so particular to its own moment in time that we simply have no living comparison left for it. Now here's where the story turns strange, because for the longest time the scientists studying bones and the scientists studying blood were not even having the same conversation. Picture a small laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, sometime in the mid-1960s, fluorescent lights humming overhead, rows of glass test tubes catching the light. A young researcher named Vincent Sarich leans over a workbench carefully mixing blood serum from a human volunteer with blood serum from a chimpanzee, then watching how the immune proteins inside react to one another. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but Sarich, working alongside a biochemist named Alan Wilson, had a wild idea. If genetic material mutates at a roughly steady pace over time, almost like a slow-ticking clock, then you could measure the chemical distance between two species and use it to calculate with real precision how long ago they shared a common relative. At the time, the accepted answer based on fossil teeth and jawbones was that humans and apes had split apart somewhere between 15 and 30 million years ago. It was practically gospel in paleontology. Sarich and Wilson ran their blood tests, crunched their numbers, and got a wildly different answer. Somewhere around 5 million years, maybe less. You can imagine how that landed. An entire field of scientists who had spent careers studying bones, measuring skulls, cataloguing fossil teeth, being told that two young researchers with a handful of test tubes had gotten nearer to the truth than they had. The pushback was immediate and it was not gentle. One well-known anthropologist reportedly said that if the biochemistry disagreed with the fossils, then the biochemistry simply had to be wrong. For years, the two camps barely spoke the same scientific language, and here is the part of the story that stings a little if you sit with it. Much of the fossil evidence propping up that older estimate rested on a single set of jaw fragments from a creature named Ramapithecus found decades earlier in what is now Pakistan and India. For years, textbooks confidently placed Ramapithecus at the very root of the human family tree, the earliest known ancestor who chose humanity over chimpanzeehood. There was just one problem. It was wrong. More complete fossils discovered later revealed that Ramapithecus was not an early human ancestor at all. It was an early relative of orangutans. An entire branch of the family tree had been mislabeled, and it took a more complete skull years later to finally set the record straight. So who ended up being right, the bone experts or the blood chemists? In the end, both were, and both were incomplete without the other. As more fossils turned up and later as full genetic sequencing became possible, the numbers converged. Most researchers today place the human and chimpanzee split somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago. Remarkably near what two young scientists calculated from test tubes of blood, decades before anyone could study a single strand of genetic code directly. Maybe the lesson here is that bones tell you what a creature looked like and genes tell you when it lived, and you really need both to see the whole picture. Or maybe the quieter lesson is that the loudest, most confident voice in a room is not always the right one. Not even in science, and not even when that voice belongs to an entire field of respected experts. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If we wanted to imagine how that ancient forest ancestor behaved, which living relative should we look to? For most of the 20th century, there was really only one answer on offer: the chimpanzee. Chimpanzees form complicated political alliances. They use tools. They sometimes wage brutal, coordinated conflict against neighbouring groups. It felt to a lot of researchers uncomfortably familiar, almost human. But there's a second cousin in this story who got quietly left out of the conversation for decades, and her name is the bonobo. Bonobos are found only in one part of the world in dense forests south of the Congo River, and for years scientists did not even realise they were looking at a separate species at all. Bonobos were smaller than common chimpanzees, and for a long time researchers simply assumed they were looking at young or undersized chimps. It wasn't until 1929 that a German anatomist named Ernst Schwarz, working with skeletal specimens in a Belgian museum, noticed that the proportions were wrong for juveniles. These were fully grown adults of an entirely separate species. Once researchers finally started studying bonobos properly in the wild decades later, they found a society that looked almost nothing like a chimpanzee troop. Bonobo groups are led by females. Conflict between groups is rare, and when tension rises within a group, bonobos are famous for smoothing it over through affection and physical closeness rather than violence. Where chimpanzee society can turn truly brutal, bonobo society leans by comparison remarkably gentle. Here's the part that should stop you for a second. Bonobos and chimpanzees are genetically almost identical to one another, sharing something like 99.6% of their genetic code. And both species are in turn about equally related to us at roughly 98.8%. Two branches split from a shared ancestor only around 2 million years ago grew into two wildly different personalities. One leans toward conflict, the other leans toward comfort. So which one is more like that ancient forest creature we started with tonight? Some researchers favour the chimpanzee model, pointing to tool use and territorial behaviour. Others favour the bonobo, arguing that gentler, more socially flexible behaviour may be the older, more original pattern, with chimpanzee aggression being the newer development. It is a real ongoing disagreement, and honestly, neither side has quite enough fossil evidence to settle it for good. In 2005, an international team of researchers finished sequencing the complete chimpanzee genetic blueprint for the first time letter by letter and laid it directly beside our own. The overall similarity held steady right around that 98.8% mark. But the difference is small as they were clustered in telling places genes tied to brain growth, to the immune system, to how bodies build and repair themselves. A little more than 1% of difference, and somehow that thin sliver is where an entire species learned to build cities, write music, and yes, tell each other stories at bedtime. Which brings us back to you lying there right now. Hold up your hand for a second if you'd like to. Look at your thumb, the way it can bend inward to meet each of your fingers. That small flexible joint is not an accident. It's inherited, passed down the very same way from that same ancient forest lineage built originally for gripping branches, now used for turning book pages and holding a warm mug of tea. Now run a hand gently down the base of your spine. Right at the very bottom, below where your back curves in, there's a small triangle of fused bone called the coccyx. Doctors sometimes still call it the tailbone because that is more or less exactly what it once was. Somewhere much further back than tonight's story even goes, your ancestors had actual tails. By the time that creature in the forest was alive 7 million years ago, the outward tail was already gone, but the bone at the root of it never fully left. It's still there, tucked inside you tonight, a small quiet leftover from a much older chapter of the story. There's a muscle too running along the inside of some people's forearms called the palmaris longus that many mammals still rely on for climbing and gripping. In roughly 10 to 15% of people today, that muscle is simply missing altogether, and nobody notices because human bodies haven't truly needed it in a very long time. If you press your thumb and little finger together and bend your wrist forward, you might just be able to feel a thin tendon standing up under your skin. If you can't find it, that's alright too. It only means your body has already quietly moved on from it. There's one more, and you have almost certainly felt this one yourself. Somewhere in the back of your jaw, if they haven't been removed, sit your wisdom teeth. Human jaws have grown steadily smaller over the last several million years, mostly because cooked, softened food demands far less crushing power than the tough, fibrous plants our ancient relatives chewed all day long. But the instructions for a third full set of molars never got deleted from the blueprint. They just got squeezed into a jaw that no longer has the room for them. That dull ache people feel in their late teens or early 20s isn't really a design flaw. It's simply a jaw that finished shrinking a long time before its dental plan caught up. None of this makes you less than that ancient forest creature, and it certainly doesn't make you more. You're not standing above her on some ladder looking down. You're simply the part of her family that kept walking, kept changing, kept adapting generation after generation for 7 million uninterrupted years, until eventually somehow it led to you warm and breathing, listening to this very sentence. But here's the strange twist in this story. The one science almost got wrong for good. For decades, the scientists holding actual fossils, actual physical proof, dismissed evidence that turned out to be right in front of them, while trusting a fossil that turned out to be almost entirely mistaken. And that one confident misplaced trust would end up shaping an entire era of how the world understood its own beginnings. It started with a skull pulled from the English countryside and a discovery that fooled some of the finest scientific minds in the world for nearly 40 straight years. That's where we're headed next. Not far from a small English village called Piltdown in the county of Sussex, there's a gravel pit that most people would walk straight past without a second look. Damp earth, scattered flint, the kind of unremarkable ditch you'd find behind half the farms in southern England. In the year 1912, that gravel pit made headlines around the entire world. A local solicitor and amateur fossil collector named Charles Dawson claimed he had found something extraordinary buried in the gravel there. Pieces of a skull, thick and heavy, alongside a jawbone that looked almost ape-like. He brought his find to Arthur Smith Woodward, the respected keeper of geology, at the Natural History Museum in London, and together in December of that year, they presented their discovery to a packed meeting of the Geological Society. The room by most accounts was electric. They called the creature Eoanthropus dawsoni, which roughly translates to Dawson's Dawn Man. Newspapers gave it a simpler, catchier name almost immediately, the earliest Englishman. It's worth pausing on Dawson himself for a moment, because in hindsight there were quiet warning signs long before 1912. Over the years he had built a modest local reputation for turning up one remarkable find after another, an unusual toad supposedly discovered sealed inside a lump of coal, a strange hybrid boat that seemed to blend Roman and native building styles, even a reported sighting of a sea serpent off the Sussex coast. Taken one at a time, each of these felt like the harmless enthusiasm of a dedicated amateur collector. Taken together, they form a pattern that almost nobody bothered to notice at the time, because Dawson was well-liked, well-connected and eager to please the professional scientists whose approval he clearly craved. And for a certain kind of British scientist at the time, that name mattered more than it probably should have. For decades, the leading theory of human evolution held that a large, sophisticated brain must have developed first, long before the rest of the body caught up. A big-brained ancestor discovered right there on English soil fit that theory beautifully. It also fit something a little less scientific, a quiet, unspoken sense of national pride, the idea that humanity itself might have taken its very first true step forward in England rather than in Africa or Asia. Here's a question worth sitting with. When a discovery tells you exactly what you already hope to hear, how carefully do you really check it? Almost nobody checked it carefully enough. Piltdown Man was accepted, taught in universities, printed in textbooks, and defended fiercely by three of the most powerful men in British anthropology, at the time Arthur Smith Woodward himself, along with anatomists Sir Arthur Keith and Grafton Elliott Smith. To be fair, not everyone was fooled. A small handful of researchers, including the American zoologist Gerrit Miller, raised doubts within just a few years, pointing out that the jaw looked suspiciously like it belonged to an ape, not a person. But their objections were largely brushed aside, treated as the noise of outsiders who simply didn't understand what British science had found. The believers held the podiums, the museum collections, and the professional reputations. The skeptics held only their doubts. And then, almost as if summoned by that early skepticism, more evidence conveniently turned up. In 1915, word spread of a second Piltdown site a couple of miles from the first, where similar bone fragments had supposedly been recovered. To most observers at the time, that was the clincher. One strange skull might be an anomaly easy enough to argue over. Two separate sites yielding the same unlikely combination of features felt like independent confirmation, the kind any careful scientist ought to trust. Doubts that had been building for a few years quietly faded. Of course, we now know that second sight never offered any real confirmation at all. It simply gave the very same hand a second convenient opportunity to plant exactly what people were already hoping to find. Now let's cross an ocean and a continent and land in South Africa in the year 1924, because this is where the story turns from strange to truly heartbreaking. A young anatomy professor named Raymond Dart, only in his early 30s, working at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, received 2 crates of fossils shipped from a limestone quarry near a town called Taung. He'd apparently been getting dressed for a friend's wedding that very afternoon when the crates arrived, and by most tellings he opened them anyway, still in his formal shirt, unable to wait. Sorting through the rock and debris, one of Dart's students, a woman named Josephine Salmon, spotted something unusual. A fossilized skull with features that looked strikingly different from anything she'd seen labeled as ape before. She brought it straight to Dart. What he found, once he'd carefully cleared away the surrounding rock over the following weeks, was the skull of a young hominin later named Australopithecus africanus, and now remembered simply as the Taung child. Here's where the real numbers matter. The Taung skull had a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's small, unremarkable nothing, like the impressive brain case of Piltdown Man. But the position of a small opening at the base of the skull, called the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord connects to the brain, told a completely different story. In creatures that walk on all fours, that opening sits toward the back of the skull. In creatures that walk upright, it shifts forward closer to the center, so the head balances neatly on top of the spine rather than hanging out in front of it. In the Taung skull, it had shifted forward. In plain terms, Dart was looking at a creature that walked upright on 2 legs long before it ever developed a large, sophisticated brain. It was the exact opposite pattern that Piltdown Man seemed to represent, and it came of all places from Africa, not from the tidy hills of southern England. Think about what that actually meant for the leading theory of the time. If Piltdown was real, walking upright was supposed to be almost an afterthought, something a creature figured out only once its brain had already grown clever enough to plan for it. Dart's little skull suggested something closer to the reverse, that our ancestors were on their feet, first hands already free long before their minds caught up to match. One of those 2 stories had to be wrong. As it turned out, the one still standing on English soil, backed by 3 respected scientists and a national newspaper headline, was the one built entirely out of filed teeth and stained bone. You can probably guess how that landed. Dart wrote up his findings and sent them to the scientific journal Nature. In the very next issue, several leading British authorities weighed in, and 3 of the 4 scientists who responded happened to sit on the very committee that had championed Piltdown Man for over a decade. They dismissed Dart's conclusions almost entirely, suggesting the Taung skull likely belonged to nothing more than an unusual young gorilla, or chimpanzee, certainly not a genuine ancestor of humankind. One of Dart's own former teachers and mentors was among the most dismissive voices of all. Dart prepared a much longer manuscript defending his interpretation in careful detail. It was turned down for publication, quite possibly under pressure from scientists still deeply loyal to the Piltdown story. Disheartened, Dart put the rejected manuscript in a desk drawer and largely stepped back from the argument for years. Here's a small human detail worth pausing on. It's easy from a distance of a full century to imagine Dart as some kind of triumphant underdog, quietly certain he was right all along. But by most honest accounts, he wasn't especially certain of anything in those years. He was young, newly arrived in an unfamiliar academic system, watching some of the most respected names in his field calmly explain to him why he had made a mistake. It's worth asking yourself honestly, How many of us would have kept insisting we were right under that kind of pressure for that long, without a shred of outside support? Support did eventually arrive, just not quickly. A Scottish-born doctor and fossil hunter named Robert Broom, already in his 60s, by the time he took up the cause, took Dart's side and spent the following 2 decades scrambling through South African caves, often on his own knees in candlelit tunnels searching for more evidence. At sites called Sterkfontein Kromdraai and Swartkrans Broom, uncovered adult Australopithecus fossils that matched the pattern Dart had described in that single child's skull years earlier. Skull after skull, each one quietly reinforcing what one dismissed young professor had already worked out from a single specimen. Slowly, one careful discovery at a time, the picture Dart had first sketched out began to hold together. By 1947, Sir Arthur Keith, the very same anatomist who had once dismissed Dart's conclusions so confidently, published a remarkable admission. He wrote in essence that the evidence brought forward by Broom had convinced him he'd been wrong, and that Dart had been right all along. It takes a particular kind of honesty for a respected scientist to say that plainly in print for the entire world to see. It's worth giving Keith some credit for that even this many decades later. But here's the twist that makes this whole story sting in a completely different way, because while Keith was busy admitting his mistake about Africa, nobody had yet questioned the fossil, sitting comfortably back in England, the one that had started this entire mess. That reckoning finally arrived in the early 1950s, and it started with chemistry rather than anatomy. A researcher named Kenneth Oakley, working at the Natural History Museum, applied a relatively new technique called fluorine absorption dating, which measures how much fluorine has soaked into buried bone over time to test the Piltdown remains. Older bones buried longer absorb more fluorine from surrounding groundwater. What Oakley found was strange. The skull and the jawbone, supposedly from the very same individual, contained wildly different amounts of fluorine. They hadn't been buried together for tens of thousands of years at all. In fact, they might not have belonged together in any sense whatsoever. By 1953, Oakley teamed up with anatomist Wilfrid Le Gros Clark and physical anthropologist Joseph Weiner to dig deeper, quite literally. What they found once they examined the bones under proper scientific scrutiny was almost embarrassing in hindsight. The skull fragments were indeed old, but human likely only a few hundred years old rather than hundreds of thousands. The jawbone belonged to an orangutan, its teeth carefully filed down by hand to mimic human wear patterns, and the entire set of bones had been artificially stained with chemicals to give them a matching aged appearance. It wasn't an honest mistake. It was a deliberate forgery, and a fairly careful one, built specifically to fool the era's leading experts. Piltdown Man collapsed almost overnight 41 years after his grand unveiling. Time magazine ran the story. Newspapers that had once printed proud headlines about the earliest Englishman now printed something closer to public embarrassment. So who actually built the hoax? For decades afterward, that question turned into its own small industry of speculation. Suspicion drifted towards several names over the years, including rather famously the author Arthur Conan Doyle, who happened to reside near Piltdown and enjoyed a passing interest in archaeology, though that theory has always rested on fairly thin, mostly circumstantial evidence. It wasn't until 2016 that a team led by researcher Isabel de Groot examined the forged bones using modern imaging and genetic techniques and found something telling. Every single forged specimen across multiple supposed discoveries at the Piltdown site over the years showed the exact same forging technique and the same unusual staining recipe. One method, repeated consistently, points strongly toward one person working alone. All the evidence pointed back to Charles Dawson himself, the amateur collector who had started the entire affair back in 1912. We may never know his full motive with total certainty, whether it was ambition, a desire for recognition among scientists who had long overlooked him, or something closer to a private joke that spiraled far beyond his control. But maybe his exact reasoning matters less than what his hoax actually cost. For 40 years, an entire generation of scientists organized their understanding of human origins around a lie, while genuine evidence patiently unearthed an ocean away by a young professor and a stubborn fossil hunter sat dismissed, unpublished, and doubted. Here's the part of this story that's worth carrying with you tonight, long after the details of jawbones and fluorine tests have faded. It wasn't a lack of intelligence that let Piltdown Man fool the finest scientific minds of an entire era. Plenty of brilliant people examined those bones over 4 decades. What fooled them was something quieter, and far more common, the simple, deeply human tendency to trust a story more easily when it flatters what you already wanted to believe, and to doubt a story more easily when it comes from somewhere unfamiliar delivered by someone with far less standing to defend it. That particular habit of mine, by the way, didn't stay behind in 1953. It's the same quiet pull that makes any of us on an ordinary Tuesday believe good news about ourselves a little too easily and question uncomfortable news a little too hard. Piltdown Man just happened to be that very ordinary, very human habit dressed up in a museum case and given a Latin name. It's a strange comfort to know that a mistake this large made by scientists this respected could eventually be corrected. It just took 40 years, one careful chemist with the right tool for the job, and a scientific community finally willing to test its own most cherished beliefs. Here's a question for you, honestly. If you'd been sitting in that packed hall in 1912 watching 2 respected gentlemen unveil the earliest Englishman, would you have asked to see the fluorine tests? Would anyone have even known to ask? That's really the quiet gift the whole Piltdown affair ended up leaving behind. Modern paleoanthropology in large part grew more careful because of this exact humiliation. Today, a major fossil claim gets checked by multiple independent laboratories before anyone dares call it settled. Bones get dated by several different chemical and physical methods, at once cross-checked against each other, rather than accepted on reputation or a compelling story alone. None of that caution existed in any organized way back in 1912. It exists now largely because Piltdown Man proved in the most embarrassing way possible exactly how badly an entire field could be fooled without it. Because once that fake English skull was finally out of the way, the real path forward opened up again, back toward Africa, back toward stone, and toward an entirely different kind of ancestor. Not one already leaning on a sophisticated brain, but one leaning on something far more practical held in a pair of steady hands. So let's follow those hands a little further, because they're about to become the whole story for a while. Tanzania, 1960. A dry, dusty gash in the earth called Olduvai Gorge cuts so deep by ancient rivers that it exposes nearly 2 million years of the past in a single cliff wall layer, stacked neatly on layer like the pages of some enormous half-buried book. Louis and Mary Leakey had already spent the better part of 3 decades combing through that gorge on their hands and knees inch by inch, in the kind of heat that makes most people give up after an afternoon brushing dust from stone with tools no fancier than a dental pick and a soft-bristled brush. Their eldest son Jonathan, then a young man helping out on site, was working near a spot where his mother had pulled a striking heavy-jawed skull from the ground the year before, and there in a layer of ancient soil Jonathan found something else entirely, fragments of a much smaller jaw, a couple of skull pieces and a scattering of delicate hand bones. The fossil belonged to a young individual, and it would eventually carry the name Homo habilis, meaning handyman, given in 1964 by Louis Leakey, along with 2 colleagues Philip Tobias and John Napier. The reasoning behind that name was simple, almost elegant. Scattered through that same layer of soil were thousands of chipped, sharp-edged stones, the oldest deliberately shaped tools yet linked to a specific fossil species at the time. Leakey looked at those delicate hand bones capable of a careful, precise grip, and made an argument that felt to him obvious. This creature made those tools. This was the first true toolmaker in the human family. Not everyone agreed, and honestly the disagreement is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you something about how messy real science actually is. Homo habilis, as researchers now understand, the species seems to have lived somewhere between roughly 2 million and 1.4 million years ago, and Louis Leakey, by most accounts, a warm but famously stubborn man, was not exactly known for backing down once he'd made up his mind about a fossil. Cranial capacity for this new species came out to something like 680 cubic centimetres, larger than the famous small-brained skull Mary had found the year before, but still nowhere near a modern human brain. Several respected scientists at the time argued this hardly justified placing the fossil in our own genus at all. Wasn't it simply a slightly bigger-brained cousin of the same African ape men already known from South Africa? Part of what made the argument so heated was a brand new dating method, potassium-argon dating, applied to that same layer of Olduvai for the first time only a year earlier. It measures the slow, steady decay of radioactive potassium trapped inside volcanic rock, and it delivered a genuine shock. The layer holding these fossils and tools was roughly 1.75 million years old, far older than most scientists had been comfortable assuming for anything resembling our own genus. An old assumption about age and an old assumption about brain size were both being challenged at exactly the same moment by the very same small, unassuming pile of bones. The debate over where exactly to draw that line between an early ancestor, worthy of the name Homo, and something still closer to Australopithecus rumbled on for decades, and in certain corners of paleontology it honestly still does. Here's a small detail that rarely makes it into the tidy version of this story. When researchers studied those hand bones closely, they found something a little more complicated than a simple modern human grip. The thumb was broad, the fingertips were wide, both features that support precise controlled pressure. But the fingers themselves were curved almost the way a chimpanzees are built, for gripping branches as much as for gripping tools. It's a hand caught mid-transition, useful for climbing and for crafting, equally at home in a tree and at a workbench of stone. Evolution rarely hands you a clean finished product. More often it hands you something like this: 2 different toolkits crammed uncomfortably into a single set of fingers doing its best. So was this creature really the first toolmaker, or simply the first one whose bones happened to survive beside the evidence? It's worth asking yourself that, because the honest answer is that nobody can say with total certainty. Other hominin species almost certainly shared that same landscape at the same time. Stone tools don't come with a signature. Maybe Homo habilis alone struck every one of those flakes. Maybe several different species were doing it side by side, and we've simply pinned the credit on whichever bones happen to end up nearest the evidence. Or maybe, and this is the quieter, stranger possibility, tool use wasn't really the property of one clever species at all, but something closer to a shared idea drifting loosely across an entire ecosystem of related creatures who were all in their own ways starting to figure out the same trick. Now here's a question that might sound almost silly at first. How hard could it possibly be to hit one rock with another rock hard enough to make a sharp edge? Sit with that for just a second before I answer it, because the real answer surprised quite a lot of very serious scientists. Before we get to that answer, it's worth clearing up something important, because wild chimpanzees out in the forest today use tools too. They strip leaves off twigs to fish termites out of a mound. They select stones of just the right weight to crack open hard-shelled nuts against a flat rock anvil, sometimes even carrying their favourite hammer stone from tree to tree across a season. None of that is nothing. But notice what it isn't. A chimpanzee finds a stone already roughly the right shape and simply uses it as is. It doesn't strike one stone against another to manufacture an entirely new tool that didn't exist in nature a moment earlier. That difference, using what you find versus deliberately making what you need, turns out to be a remarkably large cognitive gap, and it's exactly the gap Toth and Schick set out to measure with Kanzi. In the 1990s, 2 researchers named Nicholas Toth and Kathy Schick decided to test the question directly in about as near to a controlled experiment as prehistory allows. They worked with a bonobo named Kanzi at a research centre in the United States over years rather than days, using patient demonstration, gentle encouragement, and a lot of food rewards waiting on the far side of a locked box. Toth would strike 2 stones together again and again, letting Kanzi watch the angle of his wrist, the exact spot where one stone met the other, then hand Kanzi his own pair of cores and step back. It sounds almost too simple to write down. It wasn't. Kanzi truly learned to do it. He understood the basic goal and he wanted the results badly enough to keep trying. But here's the twist, and it's a good one. Compared to real Oldowan tools recovered from Olduvai and similar sites, Kanzi's flakes were noticeably less consistent, less controlled, less deliberately shaped. Bonobo wrists and shoulders simply aren't built for the same precise targeted striking angle that a human or early hominin arm can produce. Kanzi tended to strike with more of a full-body swing, almost like tossing something rather than the tight controlled tap of an experienced human napper's wrist. He grasped the concept beautifully. His body quite literally couldn't fully execute it, which tells us something rather lovely about Homo habilis actually. Making a proper Oldowan flake isn't just about brute strength, and it isn't just about wanting a sharp edge badly enough. It requires reading the internal structure of a stone, almost intuitively striking at precisely the right angle and force to send a fracture curving predictably through it, and doing that reliably over and over without wasting good material on failed attempts. That's not simple imitation. That's a small, quiet kind of engineering happening inside a brain not so different in size from a chimpanzee's, but wired evidently just a little differently. Did tool use push that brain to grow larger over the generations that followed, or did a slightly larger brain simply make tool use possible in the first place? Researchers still argue over which direction that arrow points, and it's entirely possible it points both ways at once, a slow feedback loop where better hands rewarded better thinking, and better thinking rewarded better hands, each one quietly pulling the other forward one flake at a time. Let's fast forward now roughly 700,000 years, because the story of the tools themselves doesn't stop with a simple sharpened flake. It grows into something almost strange for how long it lasted. Somewhere around 1.7 million years ago, hominins across Africa began producing a new kind of tool, entirely one that archaeologists now call the Acheulean hand axe. Picture a smooth, symmetrical, teardrop-shaped stone worked carefully on both faces with a fine, even edge running nearly all the way around it. Unlike the simple, almost accidental-looking flakes of the earlier Oldowan toolkit, these hand axes show real deliberate planning. Some fit perfectly into a human palm. Others, oddly, are far too large and heavy to have ever been comfortable or practical to use for butchering an animal or working wood. Here's the number that should stop you for a second. This exact style of tool, roughly the same shape, made the same careful way, shows up at sites stretching from southern Africa all the way to parts of Asia and Europe, and it stayed remarkably consistent for well over 1 million years. At a site called Kilombe in the Kenyan Rift Valley, archaeologists have recovered many hundreds of these hand axes clustered together in a single ancient landscape, some barely larger than a fist, others long enough to need both hands just to lift comfortably. 1 million years. Try to hold that number next to your own phone, replaced every couple of years, or the car in your driveway already old news within a decade. An entire technological tradition carried, taught and repeated with almost no meaningful change for roughly 4,000 times longer than all of recorded human history put together. Stop and consider what that kind of consistency actually demands. A shape that's specific held that steady across that many generations and that much open ground. Almost certainly wasn't something each new toolmaker simply stumbled onto alone through private trial and error. Somebody had to watch. Somebody had to be watched in turn correcting a young apprentice's grip, showing them exactly where to strike and where to hold back. Long before anyone could put the lesson into words, hominins were already teaching each other hand over hand patiently, the same way a parent today might guide a child's fingers around a set of shoelaces, So why bother making some of these hand axes so painstakingly symmetrical, so much more refined than pure function would seem to demand? In 1999, two researchers, Marek Cohn and Stephen Mithen, proposed something that raised more than a few eyebrows at the time. What if certain oversized, beautifully finished hand axes weren't primarily tools at all, but something closer to a display not unlike a peacock's tail? Making one well, they argued, demanded real skill, patient strength and planning qualities that might have made a capable toolmaker more appealing as a potential mate. A hand axe in this reading doubled as proof of good genes carried around like an early silent kind of resume. It's a truly fascinating idea, and it's also been fiercely contested ever since. Critics, including researcher Anna Machine, in a well-known published rebuttal argued the theory rests on shakier ground than it first appears. Symmetry, she pointed out, might simply be what naturally happens when a skilled, practiced hand repeats the same careful motion again and again. It could be an honest byproduct of mastery itself, requiring no courtship motive at all, the same way a skilled woodworker today might produce elegant joints purely out of habit and pride, in the work without a single romantic thought crossing their mind. Other researchers have offered a more practical explanation for the oversized specimens, specifically suggesting some of the largest, heaviest hand axes were never meant to be finished tools in the first place, but were instead something closer to a portable quarry, a dense block of good stone carried along so smaller, sharper flakes could be struck off it later, whenever and wherever they were needed. Under that reading size wasn't about showing off at all, it was simply about efficient packing for a long walk through unfamiliar country. Maybe some of those especially large, finely made hand axes really were meant to turn heads. Maybe symmetry was simply the natural fingerprint that skilled hands leave behind whether anyone was watching or not. Or maybe the quietest possibility of the three our ancestors had already stumbled onto something we still can't fully explain about ourselves today. That raw competence all on its own tends to be a little bit beautiful and a little bit persuasive whether we intend it that way or not. Here's a small thing you can try tonight if you're not too far into your own quiet, drowsy state already. Look at your own hand for a moment. Notice how naturally your thumb meets each fingertip, how easily you could turn a small object over feeling for its balance, its weight, its rough or smooth edges almost without giving it any thought at all. Ask yourself honestly how many hours of practice that quiet automatic competence would take you to relearn from nothing without a single teacher, without a single word of instruction, the way it had to be learned the very first time. That quiet automatic competence took an almost unimaginable stretch of time to build layer by layer, generation after generation, long before anyone alive could have written a single word describing how or why. And once those hands had truly learned their trade, once careful, patient toolmaking had become second nature rather than a struggle, something else started happening. Those same capable hands and the minds now guiding them stopped staying put in one gorge, one valley, one familiar stretch of African grassland. They started walking, and they didn't stop for a very, very long time. That restless, wandering chapter of the story is exactly where we're headed next. Sumatra, 1887. A young Dutch doctor steps off a ship into wet, suffocating heat carrying a medical bag, a set of scientific instruments, and an idea most of his colleagues back home considered somewhere between reckless and slightly mad. His name was Eugene Dubois. He was 29 years old, trained as an anatomist, and he had a theory he could not shake loose. If human beings truly had ancestors somewhere between ape and person, then those ancestors ought to be found where the great apes still lived, and the islands of Southeast Asia seemed as good a place as any to start. The trouble was that nobody would fund such a wild expedition. So Dubois did something that still feels remarkable to me more than a century later. He gave up a promising academic career, enlisted as a military physician in the Dutch colonial army, and effectively arranged to have himself shipped to the far side of the world at somebody else's expense. He had no fossil site in mind, no map, no evidence at all beyond a hunch. Try to imagine explaining that decision to your family at dinner. I'm leaving a secure position at a respected university to join the army in the tropics, because I believe there is a bone in the ground somewhere out there that nobody has ever seen. Good luck with that conversation. 4 years later, in 1891, working along the Solo River near a village called Trinil on the island of Java, a work crew under his direction uncovered a molar tooth, and then weeks after that a skull cap. Not a full skull. Just the top thick and heavy, stained a deep chocolate brown from the minerals it had spent hundreds of thousands of years absorbing. The following year, a thigh bone turned up at what appeared to be the same level a little more than 10 meters away. The skull cap was low and long with a heavy ridge of bone across the brow, and a brain case measuring somewhere around 900 cubic centimeters. Nowhere near a modern human, but far, far beyond any ape. The thigh bone, on the other hand, looked strikingly modern, straight and strong, clearly belonging to something that walked fully upright without any apparent effort. Dubois measured the skull cap's capacity by filling it with mustard seeds and pouring them out again, a method that sounds almost comically low-tech now, and was in fact perfectly reasonable science for the 1890s. He named his find Pithecanthropus erectus, upright ape man. Newspapers, being newspapers, immediately called it Java Man. Now here's where I want to slow down, because what happened to Dubois afterward says something a bit heartbreaking about how discovery actually works. He brought his fossils back to Europe expecting recognition. What he got instead was decades of argument. Some scientists insisted the skull cap belonged to a large extinct ape, likely a giant gibbon. Others insisted the thigh bone was simply an ordinary modern human bone that happened to wash into the same layer, which, as it happens, many researchers still suspect today. Dubois grew increasingly defensive, increasingly isolated, and eventually restricted access to his own fossils for years at a time. He'd travelled to the other side of the planet, staked his entire career on a hunch been proven substantially correct, and still spent much of his life feeling like nobody quite believed him. Have you ever been right about something long before anyone was willing to admit it? Because if so, you'd have understood Eugene Dubois rather well. What Dubois had actually found, though he could not have known its full significance at the time, was Homo erectus, the first member of our family line to leave Africa entirely, and by a considerable margin, the most successful traveller in the entire human story. Let me put that success in perspective, because the numbers here truly deserve a moment. Homo erectus first appears in the fossil record somewhere around 2 million years ago. The species persists in one region or another until somewhere in the range of 100,000 years ago, and possibly later still. That's a run of well over 1.5 million years. Modern humans, our own species, have been around for roughly 300,000 years. Homo erectus outlasted us so far by a factor of 5 or 6. If longevity is the true measure of evolutionary success, then we are at present distant runners-up to a creature most people have never heard of. And they went everywhere. Fossils turn up in eastern Africa, in the Republic of Georgia, at the edge of Europe, across India, throughout China, and out into the islands of Indonesia. All of it on foot. No maps, no roads, no idea whatsoever what lay over the next ridge. Part of what made that possible was a body built for distance in a way nothing before it had been. Earlier relatives had short legs and long arms proportions that still whispered of tree branches. Homo erectus had long legs, narrow hips, and a compact chest, the silhouette of a walker rather than a climber. Some individuals stood as tall as 5'9". That's not a scrappy little creature scurrying between thickets. That's someone who, seen from 100 yards away across open ground, might briefly be mistaken for a person you knew. There's also the matter of what they ate and what that made possible. At a site called Gesher Beno Yaakov in the valley of the Jordan River, archaeologists have recovered burnt flint fragments, charred seeds, and wood clustered in the same specific spots across multiple occupation layers spanning roughly 780,000 years ago. Random wildfires don't leave burn marks in tidy repeated locations. Hearths do. It's some of the more persuasive early evidence that these travellers weren't only walking into colder country, They were carrying a way to survive it, which raises an obvious question. Why leave at all? Africa had been home for millions of years. What sends a creature walking north generation after generation into land nobody in its family has ever seen? The honest answer is that nobody chose to leave because nobody was choosing anything. There was no decision, no departure, no farewell. Populations simply drifted a few miles per generation following herds, following water spreading into whatever valley happened to be empty next. Move 10 miles in a lifetime and in 10,000 years, your descendants are 4,000 miles away without a single one of them ever having taken what felt like a long trip. That's the strange arithmetic of migration. It isn't a journey. It's arithmetic that only looks like a journey when you compress the timeline. Although, and this is where the tidy explanation develops a small crack, walking only takes you so far. Java is an island. So is Flores further east, where stone tools have been recovered from layers roughly 1 million years old. During the coldest stretches of the ice ages, falling sea levels did connect much of Southeast Asia into one enormous landmass. So a great deal of that spread really was just walking. But not all of it. Certain water crossings in that region appear to have stayed water no matter how low the oceans dropped, which leaves researchers with an uncomfortable little puzzle and no agreed answer. Maybe small groups were swept across accidentally clinging to floating mats of vegetation torn loose by a storm, a well-documented way that animals colonize islands. Maybe some rudimentary raft was involved, though not one shred of evidence for that survives. Or maybe, and this is the possibility most researchers sit with rather than solve, we simply do not yet understand how they got there. Now, if you want the single most revealing site in this entire chapter, it isn't in Africa or Java at all. It's on a windswept hilltop in the country of Georgia, at a place called Dmanisi. Starting in the 1990s and continuing for years afterward, a team led by the Georgian researcher David Lord Kipanides recovered something extraordinary from beneath a layer of ancient volcanic rock. 5 well-preserved skulls, roughly 50 other skeletal bones, simple stone tools, and thousands of animal remains all sealed together and dated to around 1.8 million years ago. These are the oldest confirmed human relatives ever found outside of Africa, and they were not what anybody expected. Their brains were small, some as modest as 546 cubic centimeters in the most complete adult skull, which is barely larger than a chimpanzee's. Their bodies were short. They carried simple stone tools, not the refined symmetrical hand axes their African cousins were already producing at the same time. They had no evidence of fire, no clothing anyone can demonstrate, and they were sharing that cold, exposed landscape with saber-toothed cats and enormous hyenas, everything we might assume a creature needs before attempting to colonize a continent they didn't have. And they went anyway. But the detail from Dmanisi that stops me every time is a single skull belonging to an older adult who had lost nearly every tooth long before dying. The jawbone had partly reabsorbed, which takes years to happen, meaning this individual survived for a considerable stretch of time with almost no ability to chew properly, on a landscape full of predators, without agriculture, without soft food, without medicine. So how did that person eat? Some researchers argue the answer is simple biology, that a determined individual could have managed on soft plant material and bone marrow without help from anyone. Others see it differently, suggesting somebody in that group was likely preparing food for them, pounding meat, sharing what they had. It is honestly difficult to prove either way from a single skull, and serious scientists land on both sides of it. But I'll admit which reading I find more moving, and it isn't the lonely one. Because if that second interpretation holds, then care for the vulnerable is not some late refinement of civilization, something we invented alongside cities and laws. It was already there on a freezing hillside in Georgia 1.8 million years ago, among small-brained wanderers who had no words for kindness at all. The Dmanisi skulls carried one more surprise, and it caused a considerable stir when the most complete one was published in 2013. The 5 skulls, all from the same place, and the same narrow window of time, varied wildly from each other in brain size, in face shape, in jaw structure. If those same 5 skulls had been discovered scattered across different continents, researchers might well have assigned them to 3 or 4 separate species. Found together, they suggest something humbler and more interesting, that early humans varied enormously within a single population exactly the way modern people do, and that our neat family tree of carefully named species may be a good deal blurrier than the textbook diagrams admit. Which brings us back in a roundabout way to the strangest loss in this entire field. In the 1920s and 30s, excavations at a cave system near Beijing at a site called Zhoukudian produced the richest collection of Homo erectus remains ever assembled, more than 40 individuals, including several beautifully preserved skull caps. They became known as Peking Man. The German anatomist Franz Weidenreich spent years studying, measuring, drawing, and casting them in plaster. In late 1941, with war closing, and the decision was made to send the original fossils to the United States for safekeeping. They were packed into wooden footlockers and left the medical college in Beijing in early December. What happened next, nobody knows. The ship they were meant to board never carried them. The soldiers escorting them were captured within days. The footlockers and everything inside vanished completely, and despite searches spanning decades and multiple governments, not one of those original bones has ever been recovered. The theories are almost their own small genre by now. Some say the crates went down with a ship. Some say they were buried in haste at Port Town and paved over by whatever got built there afterward. One former Marine claimed years later that he had dug up a box of old bones while digging a foxhole and thought nothing of it at the time. A handful of teeth from the original excavations happened to survive in a university collection in Sweden, having been sent abroad for study long before the war, which is a strange thing to sit with. The only original pieces left are the ones that had already wandered off before anyone thought to protect them. Here's the small mercy in that story, and it's worth appreciating. Because Weidenreich had done his job with such obsessive care, casting every specimen, photographing everything, recording measurements in exhaustive detail, the science survived even when the fossils didn't. Nearly everything researchers know about Peking Man today rests on the patient work of a man who had no idea he was making the only copies that would ever exist. There's something in that worth carrying with you, I think. Weidenreich wasn't preserving anything for himself. He was doing careful, unglamorous work on the assumption that someone someday might need it. And they did. It's a decenter argument for taking the boring parts of any job seriously, honestly, since you rarely find out in advance which of your ordinary Tuesdays turns out to be the one that mattered. And while we're on the subject of things quietly handed forward, consider this. The next time you walk any real distance, a few miles on a trail or a long slow loop around your neighborhood at dusk, notice how little of it you have to think about. Your hips balance you without instruction. Your legs swing forward one after the other on a rhythm nobody taught you. Your body stays cool by sweating rather than panting. That whole quiet, efficient system, the walking machine you're carrying around, was more or less finished by the time these travelers set out. You didn't invent it. You inherited it unchanged in its essentials from creatures who used it to cross a world they had no name for. So we have a species that outlasted us 5 times over, that walked from Africa to the edge of the Pacific without so much as a compass that cared for its own, when caring cost something, and whose most famous fossils now exist only as plaster in museum drawers. And still, for all that success, Homo erectus was not the only kind of human out there. Far to the west, in a cave shaft in northern Spain, another group of ancestors was leaving behind something stranger than tools and stranger than travel. Something that looks from a distance of 400,000 years uncomfortably like a burial. Northern Spain, 1976. A geologist named Trinidad Torres is lowering himself into a limestone cave system in the hills outside the city of Burgos, and he is not looking for people at all. He's looking for bears. That is the honest truth of it. Torres was studying the fossil remains of extinct cave bears, and the caves of the Sierra de Atapuerca were known to be full of them. Somewhere down in that maze of passages was a narrow vertical shaft roughly 13 meters straight down, opening into a small chamber at the bottom. The Spanish name for it is simple and blunt, the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. Torres went down after bears. He came back up with a human jaw fragment. Picture what that shaft actually demands of a person, because it matters to everything that follows. You crawl for hundreds of meters through passages barely wide enough for your shoulders in complete darkness, with the temperature hovering somewhere around a permanent chill. Then you reach the edge of a hole and go down it on a rope into a chamber where the air barely moves and no daylight has ever reached. Even today, with modern equipment and safety lines, getting to the bottom takes real effort and real nerve. Excavation there happens in month-long campaigns, with fossils passed up hand to hand, bag by bag. And the numbers that have come out of that awkward, uncomfortable little chamber are without exaggeration the richest of their kind anywhere on Earth. Systematic excavations began in 1984. Over the following 4 decades, researchers have recovered somewhere north of 7,000 human fossil fragments, belonging to at least 29 separate individuals, dated by several independent radiometric methods to somewhere around 430,000 years ago. That single chamber contains the largest collection of pre-modern human remains ever discovered anywhere. Not the largest in Spain, the largest full stop. It helps to know that this pit is only one room in a much larger house. The Sierra de Atapuerca is riddled with caves, and a railway cutting sliced through the hillside more than a century ago, exposing layer after layer of ancient ground. Other chambers in that same ridge have produced human remains stretching back over 1 million years, some of the oldest known anywhere in Western Europe. The whole ridge is a single continuous record of people occupying one small patch of land for longer than most of us can hold in our heads. In 2000, it was recognized as a World Heritage Site, which feels like the least anyone could do. So here's the question that has occupied a small army of researchers ever since, and I'd like you to actually sit with it for a moment before we go further. How do 29 people end up at the bottom of a 13-meter shaft, deep inside a cave system with no natural entrance nearby? Take your time with that one, because every obvious answer runs into trouble. Did they fall in accidentally? One person maybe, 2 if you stretch it. But 29 in a spot that requires hundreds of meters of crawling just to reach the edge of the drop. Nobody wanders into that by mistake, not once, let alone repeatedly. Did they make a home down there? No, absolutely not. There is no light, no water source, no hearth, no sign of habitation whatsoever. And the chamber is far too awkward to reach for everyday use. Were they dragged in by predators? This is the explanation that sounds most plausible at first, and researchers took it seriously for years. But it doesn't hold together either. Carnivores leave signatures, gnaw marks, cracked, long bones, tooth punctures. The human remains in the pit are largely free of that kind of damage. Bear remains are present in the chamber, certainly, but the pattern of the human bones doesn't match a predator's larder, which leaves an answer that is either obvious or outrageous, depending on how comfortable you are with what it implies. Somebody put them there on purpose. Bodies carried through hundreds of meters of pitch-dark passage and lowered or dropped into a shaft. Repeatedly over some meaningful stretch of time, 400,000 years before anyone built a temple, a tomb or a graveyard. Now before we get carried away, I want to be careful here because the researchers themselves are careful. Nobody has found grave goods arranged around the bodies. Nobody has found evidence of ritual in the sense we would recognize it. It is entirely possible this was practical rather than reverent a way of keeping decomposing bodies away from the areas where people slept, and ate away from the smell, away from the scavengers it might attract. That is a real hypothesis and a reasonable one. But then there's the hand axe, In the field season of 1998, the team working under Juan Luis Arzuaga pulled a single stone tool out of that chamber. A hand axe worked on both faces made of quartzite, and here's the detail that raises the hair on your arms a little. It is reddish pink, a fine-grained stone of a colour and quality not commonly found in the surrounding area. Somebody chose that stone specifically. Somebody carried it a distance. And it is to this day the only stone tool ever recovered from that chamber out of 7,000 fragments of bone. The team nicknamed it Excalibur, which is, let's be fair, an outstanding name for a stone tool pulled out of a pit at the bottom of a cave. Archaeologists get accused of many things, but a lack of flair for naming is not one of them. Think about what that means for a second. Thousands of pieces of bone and one tool. If people had been sheltering down there or passing through regularly, or using the chamber for anything routine, you would expect debris, broken flakes, discarded pieces, the ordinary litter that human activity leaves behind everywhere. Instead, nothing. Except one beautiful, deliberately chosen, unusually coloured hand axe sitting among the dead. It shows no real signs of heavy use either, which is its own small puzzle. This was not somebody's worn-out working blade tossed aside at the end of its life. It was, as far as anyone can tell, in excellent condition when it went into that shaft. Was it an offering? Some researchers believe so and argue it represents the earliest evidence of symbolic behaviour toward the dead in the entire human record. Others push back, pointing out that a single object proves very little and that it might have arrived down the shaft by pure accident, dropped or washed in. And honestly, both camps have a fair point. Maybe it was a gift for someone who mattered. Maybe it was a coincidence with terrible timing for anyone hoping to keep this story tidy. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that sits with me longest, the difference between those two things was not yet a clear distinction in anybody's mind 400,000 years ago, and we are trying to sort ancient behaviour into modern categories that simply hadn't been invented yet. What we can say with far more confidence is who these people were and what their days were like, and this is where the pit becomes something more than a mystery. Because 29 individuals from a single population is not a fossil, it's a community. It lets researchers do something almost impossible elsewhere in this field. Study a group of ancient humans as a group with all their variation, their injuries and their illnesses on display. Physically, they would have looked sturdy to you. Powerful chests, wide shoulders, thick bone throughout faces built forward with heavy brows. Their brain volumes overlap comfortably with the modern range. Several of the skulls preserve the tiny bones of the middle ear intact, which is a rare gift. And studies modelling how sound would have travelled through those ears found something worth pausing on their hearing was tuned to roughly the same frequency band that carries human speech, and noticeably different from that of a chimpanzee. That is not proof of language. Researchers are quite firm about that. But it does mean their ears were already built to catch exactly the kind of sound a voice makes. One nearly complete pelvis recovered from the chamber belongs to a male individual of advanced age well past 45, which in that world was a considerable achievement. His lower spine shows multiple degenerative conditions, the kind that would have made bending, twisting, and probably walking any real distance painful and awkward. He would have moved slowly. He would have struggled with terrain that his companions crossed without a thought. And he survived long enough for those conditions to develop fully in the bone, which takes years. Another individual, an older adult represented by a well-preserved skull, shows severe dental infection, the sort that spreads into the jaw and causes constant grinding pain and serious difficulty chewing. Researchers consider that infection the likely cause of death, but again notice the timeline. Conditions like that do not develop overnight. That person was in significant discomfort, unable to eat normally, for a long stretch before the end. So here's a question I find honestly moving. In a landscape where speed and strength decided whether you ate, how does a person with a failing spine or a person who cannot chew survive for years? The cautious answer is that we cannot prove anyone helped them, and several serious researchers make exactly that point. Perhaps these individuals scraped by on their own at the edges of the group. Perhaps they were tolerated rather than supported. That reading is legitimate, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the alternative reading that somebody shared food, waited on the trail, adjusted the group's pace, is at minimum equally consistent with what the bones show. And the sheer number of surviving individuals with serious conditions in this one small sample makes the lonely explanation harder to hold in my view than the generous one. There is one more thing the pit gave up, and it took 30 years of technology to unlock it. For decades, the fossils from that chamber were classified as an early European human population, generally assigned to a species called Homo heidelbergensis, and their relationship to later groups was argued over endlessly. Then, in 2016, a team including researcher Matthias Meyer succeeded in recovering nuclear genetic material from the bones, an extraordinary technical feat given the age and the conditions. Ancient genetic material breaks down quickly in warm environments, but a permanently cold, stable cave chamber turns out to be one of the better preservation environments on the planet, which is a lovely irony, given how much trouble that chamber caused everyone who had to climb into it. The result settled the argument. These people sit firmly on the Neanderthal branch of the family tree. Not modern human ancestors, not a dead end, but early members of the lineage that would eventually produce the Neanderthals proper several 100,000 years later, which reframes everything you've just heard. The careful treatment of the dead, the possible offering the individuals with serious conditions surviving into old age, none of that belongs to our own species at all. It belongs to a cousin lineage that most people, for most of the last century and a half, were taught to imagine as slow, brutish, and incapable of anything resembling tenderness. There's a small forensic footnote here too, and I'll keep it brief because it's a somber one. One of the skulls from the chamber shows 2 injuries to the front of the head made around the time of death, and detailed analysis of their shape and angle indicates they came from the same object striking twice. The researchers who published that work interpret it as evidence of a conflict between individuals rather than an accidental fall. It is, as far as anyone can currently tell, the earliest such case documented in the human fossil record. I mention it not for shock value, but because it belongs in the same picture as everything else. Care and conflict in the same population in the same chamber. Which, if you think about it, is more or less the description of every human community that has ever existed since. So let me leave you with this. 400,000 years ago, in a cold, dark corner of what is now northern Spain, a group of people were doing something with their dead that they did not have to do. It cost them effort. It gained them nothing practical that we can identify with confidence. They crawled through the dark, carrying the bodies of people they knew, and at least once somebody brought along a beautiful reddish stone tool and left it behind. We do not know what they were thinking, we never will. But we know they were thinking something, and here is where it quietly reaches forward and touches you. Every culture on this planet, without exception, does something with its dead beyond the practical minimum. We wash bodies, we choose particular clothes, we select an object and place it in a coffin, or scatter something at sea, or set a photograph somewhere the light falls on it. Nobody had to teach us that impulse. Nobody sat any of us down and explained why a person should feel that walking away isn't quite enough. If you have ever stood at a graveside holding something you meant to leave behind, or found yourself unable to throw out an object simply because it belonged to someone, then you already understand the pit of bones better than any measurement ever taken from it. That capacity to look at a person who is gone and feel that the moment requires more than simply walking away is very old. Older than our species. Older than language as we would recognize it. It was already there waiting in the dark at the bottom of that shaft, long before anyone alive today could have put a single word to it. And these were not the last of that lineage to surprise us. Far to the east, on a small island in what is now Indonesia, an entirely different branch of the human family was working out a solution to a problem that no cave in Spain could have prepared them for. The answer they arrived at was so unexpected that when researchers finally uncovered it, a good portion of the scientific community flatly refused to believe it was real. Let me take you somewhere warmer. The island of Flores sits in the long chain of Indonesian islands roughly 500 kilometers east of Java Green and steep and volcanic. In September of 2003, a joint Australian and Indonesian excavation team was working inside a large limestone cave there, a cave the local people call Liang Bua, which translates rather beautifully as cool cave. They were not looking for a new species. They were looking for evidence of modern humans passing through Southeast Asia on the way to Australia. Perfectly reasonable goal. Well-funded, well-planned, unglamorous. 6 meters down in the cave floor, a member of the team uncovered the top of a skull. Now, at first everyone assumed it belonged to a young individual because it was small. Astonishingly small. But as more of the skull and jaw came free of the sediment over the following days, one of the specialists noticed something that changed the entire afternoon. Every tooth in that jaw was a permanent adult tooth, fully erupted, worn from years of use. This was not a young person at all. This was a fully grown adult, roughly 30 years old at death, who stood about 1 meter tall and had a brain of somewhere between 380 and 426 cubic centimeters. Let me put that in perspective because the number is difficult to absorb otherwise. A modern human brain typically runs somewhere between 1200 and 1700 cubic centimeters. This adult's brain was roughly a third of that, smaller than any member of our own genus previously recorded, about the size of a grapefruit if you want something to hold in your mind. And she was not alone down there. Continued excavation eventually produced fossil material from at least a dozen individuals, plus stone tools, plus animal remains, all from the same cave. The team published in 2004 and named a new species Homo floresiensis. The press, being the press and being unable to resist, immediately called them hobbits, which I will admit is a wonderful nickname, and also one that probably cost the researchers a certain amount of scientific dignity over the following decade. It is hard to be taken entirely seriously when every headline about your careful anatomical work includes a reference to a fantasy novel. So here's the question that took over paleoanthropology for the better part of 10 years. What on earth was this? Before we get to the fight, let's talk about the island itself, because Flores has form when it comes to strangeness. In the same cave deposits alongside the small human remains, the team recovered the bones of a creature called stegodon, an elephant relative, and on Flores a dwarfed one shrunk down to a fraction of its mainland size. They also found rats, enormous rats the size of a small cat, and Komodo dragons, which unlike the elephants had stayed thoroughly and unapologetically large. This is not a coincidence, and it has a name. Biologists call it the island rule, and it works in both directions at once. Put a large mammal on a small island with limited food and no serious predators, and over many generations the population tends to shrink because smaller bodies need fewer calories to keep going, and small individuals survive the lean years. Put a small animal on that same island with fewer predators hunting it, and less competition, and it tends to grow. Islands squeeze the big and inflate the small until everything meets somewhere in an unsettling middle. You can see this playing out in places all over the world. Dwarf elephants once roamed Mediterranean islands, some barely taller than a large dog. Dwarf deer, dwarf hippos, dwarf mammoths on a Siberian island that survived until surprisingly recent times. Meanwhile, islands have given us giant tortoises, giant flightless birds and rodents that would make a house cat reconsider its priorities. So the researchers' proposal was straightforward, at least on paper. A population of Homo erectus somehow reached Flores, got stranded, and over hundreds of thousands of years the island did to them exactly what it does to every other large mammal. It made them smaller. That word somehow is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence, and it's worth pausing on. Flores sits east of a stretch of deep water that has never dried out, not even during the coldest, lowest sea levels of the ice ages. Whatever got there crossed genuine open ocean. The dwarf elephants managed it probably by swimming, since elephants are surprisingly capable swimmers and have been observed crossing significant distances. But nobody is quite sure how a group of upright walking hominins made the same trip, nor how many of them arrived, which matters enormously. A viable founding population needs to be large enough to reproduce for generations without collapsing. Arriving once by accident with too few people is a story that ends quickly and leaves no fossils at all. Simple, elegant, and enormously controversial because of one detail. Body shrinking is one thing, brain shrinking by that much is another. Brain size across the animal kingdom tends to be relatively conservative. It does not usually scale down as aggressively as body size. A brain of 400 cubic centimeters in a member of our own genus, less than 70,000 years ago, in a creature that also left behind stone tools, struck many researchers as flatly impossible. Which brings us to the objection, and I want to handle this carefully and fairly because the scientists on the other side of it were not fools. Indonesia's most senior paleoanthropologist at the time, Teuku Jacob, along with several international colleagues, argued that the small skull did not represent a new species at all. Their proposal was that this individual was a modern human affected by a developmental condition, one of several known conditions that can result in a considerably reduced brain and small stature. On that reading, the researchers had not found a species. They had found one unwell person, and built an entire branch of the family tree on top of her. There was also, and it pains me to report this, a fairly ugly professional dispute involved. At one point, the original fossils were removed to another institution for study without the excavation team's agreement, and when they came back, some of the specimens had sustained damage. Casts had been taken, certain bones were broken. The two sides did not, shall we say, exchange warm holiday cards afterward. Science is done by human beings, and human beings sometimes behave exactly as you would expect when careers and national pride are on the line. So how do you settle an argument like that? The answer turned out to be beautifully mundane. You stop staring at the skull and you go look at the wrist. Here's why that works. The human wrist contains a bone called the trapezoid, and in modern humans, in every single one of us, it has a distinctive boot-like shape. That shape appeared in our lineage relatively recently. In earlier hominins and in apes, the equivalent bone is wedge-shaped, instead more like a slice of pie. The important part is this: developmental conditions affecting brain growth do not reach back into deep evolutionary history and reshape your wrist bones into an ancestral form. That is not something a condition can do. Wrist architecture is laid down early, and it follows the pattern your species carries. The wrist bones from Liangboa were wedge-shaped, ancestral, not modern human at all, and the shoulder joint was oriented differently from ours in a way that would have made throwing awkward. And the feet were long relative to the legs with a shallow arch, and the jaw had no chin, which sounds like a small thing, until you realized that a bony chin is one of the few features entirely unique to Homo sapiens. No other human species has one. Add it up, and the developmental condition explanation required a single individual to have coincidentally developed half a dozen separate ancestral traits scattered across the entire skeleton. That is asking a great deal of coincidence. And it became mathematically absurd once fossil material from additional individuals turned up in the same cave spanning thousands of years of deposits. One unwell person is possible. A dozen across many generations, all with the same unusual set of features, is not. The species held, Homo floresiensis, is real. Now here's a question I'd like you to actually consider for a moment, because it's the one that keeps researchers awake. If their brains were roughly the size of an early hominins, how were they making stone tools, butchering dwarf elephants, and apparently using fire? Because they were. The cave produced stone flakes, prepared cores, and animal bones bearing cut marks, along with charred bone and fire-cracked rock in the same layers. Some researchers argue this proves brain size is a much worse predictor of capability than we assume, and that internal organization matters far more than raw volume. Others suspect the tools may be more basic than they initially appeared, and that the story has been slightly oversold. Both positions are defended by serious people. Or perhaps the honest answer is the uncomfortable one that we have been using brain size as a proxy for intelligence for a century and a half, largely because it is easy to measure, not because it is especially reliable. The dates have moved too, and that story's worth a minute. The original announcement placed these people at around 18,000 years ago, which was startling because it would have meant another human species surviving well into the era when our own ancestors were painting cave walls in Europe. Careful re-excavation later revealed that the sediment layers had been misinterpreted. The deposits containing the fossils were older than the layers immediately above them. The revised figures place the skeletal remains at roughly 60,000 to 100,000 years old, with associated stone tools stretching back much further. Still recent, still a genuine overlap or something very near one with modern humans arriving in the region. Just not as recent as first reported. And there's a stranger footnote from the other side of the island. In 2016, and again in a study published in 2024, researchers working at a site called Mata Menga in tropical grasslands, about 75 kilometers east of the cave, recovered hominin fossils from sandstone dated to around 700,000 years old. Teeth, a jaw fragment, and eventually a piece of an adult upper arm bone so small that when it was first noticed, people assumed it belonged to a reptile. That arm bone is the smallest adult limb bone of its kind ever recovered anywhere in the human fossil record, which means the shrinking had already happened in full 700,000 years ago. Whatever arrived on Flores did not slowly dwindle over the last stretch before extinction. It got small early and then stayed small successfully for an almost incomprehensible span of time. And Flores, it turns out, was not even a one-off. Further north in a cave in the Philippines, researchers have described another small-bodied human species from an entirely separate island, with its own peculiar mixture of ancient and modern features. 2 islands, 2 independent experiments. The same broad answer arrived at twice by 2 different populations with no contact between them. When nature repeats itself like that, it usually means we're looking at a rule rather than an accident. Have you ever wondered what the local people of Flores made of all this? Because there is an oral tradition on the island, recorded long before any of these excavations, describing small hairy people who once dwelled in the forests and caves. In the villages near the excavation site, they are called by a local name, and the stories are the ordinary sort of folklore, half warning and half joke. Now, I want to be careful here. Folklore is not evidence, and no serious researcher claims those stories preserve a genuine memory across 60,000 years. Oral traditions simply do not last that long. But it does make you smile a little that people were telling stories about small forest folk on that exact island for generations, while the actual bones sat 6 meters beneath a cave floor a short walk away. So what happened to them? The most likely answer involves the arrival of modern humans in the region combined with a changing environment. The dwarf elephants disappear from the record at around the same time. There may also have been volcanic activity. It is probably not one clean cause, but several pressures arriving together, which is usually how extinctions actually work. But here is what I keep returning to, and it's the reason this chapter matters more than its charming nickname suggests. For most of the last century, the story of human evolution was told as a single line of progress. One species at a time, each one taller and smarter than the last, marching neatly toward us. Flores destroys that picture completely. It shows a human population that got smaller, that lost brain volume, that walked backward down the supposed ladder, and that thrived on that island for something on the order of 700,000 years. Which incidentally is more than twice as long as our own species has existed. Evolution is not a ladder. It never was. It is a bush wildly branching, and the branches go sideways and downward as readily as up because there is no up. There is only what works here on this particular patch of ground this year. They were not a failed version of us. They were an excellent version of themselves on an island that asked for something specific and got it. There's a small comfort buried in that, I think, if you want one tonight. We are surrounded constantly by a story that says bigger and faster and more is the only direction worth going, and that anything which slows down or scales back has somehow lost. 700,000 years of small, quiet, competent survival on one green island says otherwise. Fitting your circumstances well is not a lesser achievement than outgrowing them. It might be the harder one. And they were not the only branch out there doing something unexpected. Because far to the northwest, in the caves and valleys of Europe and Western Asia, another population of humans had been thriving for a very long time indeed. We have known about them since the 1800s. We named them, described them, put them in museums, and made them a byword for everything crude and stupid. Almost every single thing we said about them turned out to be wrong. Picture a limestone quarry in Western Germany, August of 1856. The chemical industry is booming, everyone wants lime, and a crew of workmen is blasting open a small cave in a narrow river valley near Dusseldorf. The valley has a name that will shortly become one of the most recognized words in the study of human origins, though nobody working there that morning has the faintest idea. Inside the cave, buried in rubble, the crew hits bones. They assume they have found a cave bear. Bear remains are common in these caves, and bare bones are not worth stopping work over, so they start shoveling the whole lot out with the rest of the debris. We came within about 10 minutes of losing the single most important fossil in the history of this field. What saved it was a supervisor at the quarry who thought the bones looked odd enough to set aside and who knew a local schoolteacher with an interest in natural history. That teacher's name was Johann Karl Fuhlrott. He taught at a school in a nearby town. He was not a university man. He had no institutional standing whatsoever, and when the bones arrived in his hands, he did something that a great many credentialed experts would spend the next several decades failing to do. He looked at them properly. A skull cap with a low forehead and a heavy ridge of bone above the eyes, limb bones noticeably thicker and stronger than any he'd handled before, and crucially bones that had been thoroughly mineralized, which suggested serious age. Fuhlrott went back to the quarry hoping to recover the rest of the skeleton, but he was too late. The remainder had already gone out with the rubble. He worked with what he had, and he concluded correctly that these were the remains of a human being unlike any human being alive. He brought them to an anatomy professor at the University of Bonn named Hermann Schaffhausen, and in the summer of 1857, the two of them presented the find to a regional natural history society. This is 3 years before Darwin's book on species reached the general public. There was at that moment no accepted scientific framework in which an extinct kind of human could comfortably exist. The reception predictably was brutal. The most influential objection came from Rudolf Virchow, who was arguably the most respected medical scientist in Germany at the time and a giant of modern pathology. Virchow examined the bones and concluded they belonged to an ordinary modern person whose skeleton had been altered by illness and injury over a lifetime. Not an ancient species, just an unlucky individual. And because Virchow's authority in matters of bone and disease was very nearly absolute, that verdict effectively froze the question for years. Here's the detail that makes this particular chapter of scientific history sting a little. This was not even the first time these bones had turned up. A partial skull had been recovered in Belgium in 1829. Another was found in a quarry at Gibraltar in 1848. Both sat in collections, catalogued, examined, and entirely unrecognised for what they were. The evidence had been sitting in front of the scientific community for nearly 30 years. Nobody had a category for it, so nobody saw it. It took until 1864 for an Irish geology professor named William King to propose a formal species name, Homo neanderthalensis, after the valley. That name carries a small distinction worth noting. It was the first time in history anyone had formally named an extinct species of human. Everything in this field, every argument about every fossil we have discussed tonight, descends from that moment in a German quarry when a supervisor decided some strange bones were worth keeping. And now we come to the part of the story that shaped how billions of people would picture their own ancestors for the next 100 years. Between 1911 and 1913, A French paleontologist named Marcelin Boule published a detailed study of a remarkably complete Neanderthal skeleton that had been recovered from a cave in southwestern France a few years earlier. The individual was an older adult male, and he has been known ever since as the Old Man of La Chapelle-aux-Saints. Boule's reconstruction was thorough, confident, and wrong in almost every way that mattered. He described a creature that could not stand fully upright, a spine without the graceful curve of a modern human back, bent knees, hips that never straightened, a head thrust forward on the shoulders rather than balanced on top of the neck, and most memorably, a big toe that stuck out sideways from the foot like a thumb the way an ape's does, which would mean a shuffling, grasping half-simian gait. To go with the anatomy, an illustration was commissioned and published in a widely circulated London newspaper, a hunched, hairy, glowering figure more gorilla than person. That single image did more to shape the public imagination than any scientific paper ever written. Every stooping cartoon caveman, every dim-witted brute in a film, every insult that uses the word Neanderthal to mean stupid traces back through that drawing to Boule's reconstruction. It became the picture in everyone's head, and it stayed there for the better part of half a century. So how did he get it so comprehensively wrong? Two things went into it, and I want to be fair about both. The first is straightforward: the old man was old. His skeleton showed advanced degenerative joint disease, particularly in the spine. He had lost most of his teeth years before death. His posture in life was almost certainly affected by decades of wear on a hard-working body. Boule was in part describing an individual's condition and mistaking it for a species' anatomy. The second reason is less comfortable and honestly more interesting. Boule found what he was already expecting to find. The intellectual climate of the early 20th century had strong opinions about who counted as advanced and who did not, and a stooping, brutish, evolutionary dead end fit those expectations perfectly. It also fit neatly alongside a certain celebrated English skull that we discussed earlier this evening, one that suggested a big brain came first and everything else followed. If Neanderthals were crude and doomed, then the line leading to modern Europeans could stay clean and separate and flattering. The correction took until 1957, when two anatomists, William Strauss and Alfred Cave, re-examined the same remains and published a re-evaluation. Their conclusion was that Neanderthals stood and walked essentially the way we do. They also offered a memorable image, which I will paraphrase rather than quote dress one in modern clothes. Put him on a New York subway train, and the other passengers probably would not look twice. Since then, the picture has been revised further still. The physical anthropologist erectus has argued that the arthritis explanation lets Boule off somewhat lightly, and that a good portion of the errors came from Boule simply misinterpreting the anatomy in front of him, working with fragmentary material and firm expectations, which sounds about right to me. It is comforting to say a great scientist was misled by a diseased skeleton. It is more honest to say he saw what he wanted to see, and that the bones were only partly responsible. So what were they actually like? Physically sturdier than us in almost every dimension. Broad chests, wide shoulders, thick limb bones with heavy muscle attachments, and short lower legs and forearms, a body plan that holds heat efficiently in cold weather. Their brain volume, and this is the number that surprises people most, averaged slightly larger than the modern human average. Not smaller, larger. Brain volume is a poor measure of anything, as we have already discussed with a certain small island population, but it is worth stating plainly for anyone still carrying the cartoon version around. Their bones also tell you about their working days. Neanderthal skeletons frequently show injury patterns concentrated in the upper body, of a kind sometimes compared to those seen in people who work in direct physical contact with large animals. That suggests hunting at short range with thrusting spears against animals substantially larger than the hunters. It is not a lifestyle that rewards timidity, and it is very much not a lifestyle a solitary creature survives. Bringing down large game at arm's length requires several people acting together, holding position, trusting each other completely. Let me give you a few pieces of evidence all recovered in recent decades, all of them things that would have made Bull put down his pen. At a site in northern Spain, researchers analysed hardened dental plaque scraped from Neanderthal teeth. Trapped inside that plaque were microscopic traces of what these individuals had been chewing. One individual who had an abscess in the jaw and evidence of an intestinal parasite had traces of poplar in his dental plaque. Poplar bark contains salicylic acid, which is the active ingredient in aspirin. The same individual showed traces of a mold with antibiotic properties. Now we cannot prove intent from a residue, and researchers are careful about that. But an individual in pain chewing exactly the plants that relieve pain is at minimum a striking coincidence. Then there's the glue. Neanderthals attached stone points to wooden shafts using tar made from birch bark. Producing that tar is not simple. Birch bark must be heated to a specific temperature range, while being kept away from open air, because if oxygen reaches it, the whole batch simply burns. Modern experimental archaeologists have shown there are ways to manage this with earth and rolled bark and careful control, but every method requires the maker to plan several stages ahead and to understand that a material can be transformed into a different material by heat alone. That is chemistry performed at least 50,000 years before anyone had a word for it, and then in 2018 a study applied a dating technique to the mineral crusts that had grown over painted marks on the walls of 3 separate caves in Spain. The results came back older than 64,000 years, which is a problem or a revelation depending on your point of view, because modern humans do not appear in Western Europe until roughly 20,000 years after that. If those dates hold, and some researchers still contest them, then the oldest known cave paintings in Europe were not made by us at all. From the same broad period in the same region come perforated seashells stained with mineral pigment, some carried inland from the coast, apparently strung and worn. From sites further east come eagle talons cut from the foot and polished at the contact points in a way that only happens if they were strung together and rubbed against each other over time. A necklace of eagle claws is not a tool. It does not butcher anything or cut anything or keep anyone warm. It exists purely to be seen. Whether that seeing meant status or belonging or something, we have no concept for somebody made a decision about how they wish to appear to others. There's one more, and it is the most argued over of the lot. In a cave in northern Iraq, excavations in the 1950s uncovered the remains of several Neanderthal individuals, including an adult male with severe injuries, a withered arm damage to the side of the head affecting one eye and healed fractures. He had survived those injuries for years. Around one of the burials, the excavator found unusually dense clumps of ancient pollen from flowering plants and proposed that the man had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers. It became one of the most beloved stories in archaeology, and it has been challenged hard ever since. Later researchers pointed out that a certain species of burrowing bee stores pollen in exactly that kind of clustered pattern, and that rodents tunneling through the sediment could easily have carried plant material down. The flowers may have arrived by themselves. Recent excavations at the same cave have continued with new remains recovered and analysed using methods unavailable 70 years ago, and the debate is still open. What is not in dispute is the injured man himself. Whatever happened with the pollen, somebody was feeding a person who could not hunt for years. So here is what I keep circling back to. We spent 150 years describing these people as failures. We used their name as an insult. We drew them hunched and stupid and put them in museum halls as a cautionary tale about evolutionary dead ends. And the entire time the evidence for something quite different was sitting in the same collections waiting for somebody to ask a better question. It is worth saying plainly how long they managed it. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia for somewhere in the range of 350,000 years, through repeated ice ages, through climate swings that would have emptied out most species in landscapes that killed the unprepared quickly. They did that without agriculture, without permanent settlements, without writing. A dead end, we called it. 350,000 years of a dead end. Have you ever noticed how satisfying it is to have a category for someone? How much easier it makes everything. Once a person is filed under a heading, you no longer have to keep looking at them. The category does the work. You already know what they are like, what they are capable of, what they would say if you asked. And the tidier the category, the less likely you are to notice the evidence that does not fit because you are not actually looking anymore. Boole was a serious scientist with excellent training and access to the best material in Europe, and none of that protected him because the failure was never about ability. That, I think, is the real lesson buried in the Neander Valley. The stooping caveman was never a scientific conclusion. It was a story we found comfortable dressed up in measurements, and there is a final twist in this one that turns the whole 100-year insult on its head. Because we did not simply misjudge these people from a safe distance. Our ancestors met them, spent time with them, and something happened during those encounters that left a permanent record not in the ground but inside the bodies of nearly everyone listening to this right now. It took a single fragment of finger bone from a cave in southern Siberia to reveal it. Now travel east with me into the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, where a river valley cuts between forested slopes and a wide cave mouth opens in the rock above it. The cave has a lovely, slightly ridiculous name. Sometime in the 18th century, a hermit called Dennis is said to have made his home there, and the locals started referring to the place as Dennis's Cave. That is where the name comes from. No Grand Latin, no scientific committee. A man moved into a cave, and 2 centuries later his first name would end up attached to an entire population of humans he never knew existed. Russian archaeologists had been excavating there for decades. It is a rich site with layers going back hundreds of thousands of years, and it had already produced Neanderthal material along with quantities of stone tools. In 2008, working under the direction of Anatoly Derevianko and Michael Shunkoff, the team recovered a bone fragment so small it barely registered as anything at all, a piece of a finger bone roughly the size of a coffee bean. The fossil belonged to a young individual, which is about all the anatomy could tell anyone. No skull, no teeth, no jaw, nothing that could be measured, compared or classified in any traditional way. In any previous era of this science, that fragment would have been catalogued, boxed and forgotten. There is simply nothing you can do with a chip of finger bone. But it was 2008, and a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany had spent about 25 years quietly preparing for exactly this moment. To understand what happened next, you need to know about the man running that laboratory, because his career is a masterclass in patience. Svante Pääbo had been trying to extract ancient genetic material since the early 1980s, when he was still a graduate student, and the idea was considered somewhere between ambitious and faintly absurd. He worked on Egyptian mummies, he got results, he published, and the results made headlines, and then over the following years it slowly became apparent that much of what he had recovered was contamination. Modern genetic material from the hands of archaeologists, from museum staff, from Pääbo himself, drifting into samples and swamping whatever ancient traces remained. That could have ended his career. Instead, he treated the contamination problem as the actual research question, which I find rather admirable. Over the following 2 decades, his laboratories developed sterile, clean rooms with positive air pressure, full body suits, ultraviolet sterilization of every surface protocols, requiring that every researcher's own genetic profile be on file so their contamination could be identified and subtracted. They developed methods to recognize the specific chemical damage patterns that accumulate in truly ancient material so that authentic sequences could be distinguished from modern intruders. None of this is glamorous. Nobody makes a documentary about air filtration protocols. But by 2008, that laboratory could do something nobody else on Earth could reliably do: pull real genetic information out of a fragment of bone tens of thousands of years old and know it was real. In 2022, Pääbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for that body of work, which strikes me as one of the more satisfying outcomes in recent scientific history. A young researcher publishes a result, the result turns out to be contaminated, and rather than quietly moving to a safer field, he spends the next 30 years building the machinery required to do it properly. There is a lesson buried in that about what to do with an early public mistake, and it is not the lesson most of us instinctively reach for. The finger bone arrived in Leipzig, and a researcher named Johannes Krause set about sequencing the mitochondrial genome from it. Now let me set your expectations the way theirs were set. Denisova Cave had produced Neanderthal remains. It sits in a region Neanderthals once occupied. The overwhelmingly likely outcome was a Neanderthal sequence which would be mildly interesting and go into a database. The second possibility was a modern human sequence which would be less interesting still. Krause got neither. The sequence he pulled from that fragment sat outside both groups on its own branch, distinct from Neanderthals and distinct from us. Not a variant, not a hybrid. A separate population, one that nobody had ever proposed, that appeared in no textbook, that had left behind no recognized fossils, no named skull, no anatomical description of any kind. Krause reportedly called Peebo late at night to tell him. I have always liked imagining that phone call. Two scientists on the line, one of them holding a result that rewrites a family tree and neither of them entirely willing to believe it yet. They published in 2010. And here's what makes this moment unlike anything else in the 2 centuries of science we have been walking through tonight. Every other human population we have discussed was found first as bones. Someone dug up a skull, measured it, argued about it, drew it, named it. Anatomy came first always, and genetics arrived much later to confirm or complicate the picture. The Denisovans were discovered the other way around, genetics first, anatomy nowhere. For years afterward, the honest scientific position was that a whole population of humans had existed spread across Asia, interacted with our ancestors and left descendants, and we had absolutely no idea what any of them looked like. Imagine being asked to describe a stranger from nothing but their handwriting. So let's talk about what they left behind, because they left it in people. Modern populations across mainland Asia carry small traces of Denisovan ancestry, generally under 1%. But move southeast out into the islands and the number climbs sharply. Populations in Papua New Guinea and parts of Australia carry something in the range of 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry, which is a considerable amount, and it means that somewhere in the deep past, modern humans moving through Southeast Asia met these people and had children with them repeatedly over generations. And one of those inherited fragments turns out to matter enormously in a way you can point to on a map. There is a gene called EPAS1 which helps regulate how the body responds to low oxygen. Most human populations, when taken to high altitude, respond by producing more red blood cells, which thickens the blood and over the long term causes serious problems. Tibetan populations do not do this. They have a variant of that gene that allows efficient oxygen use without the dangerous thickening, and it is why people can settle and work permanently at altitudes that leave the rest of us gasping. That variant did not devolve in Tibetans. It was inherited from Denisovans, and it spread through the population because it worked. Sit with that a moment. A population that vanished tens of thousands of years ago that we cannot describe anatomically, that we found by accident in a chip of finger bone, is the reason a farmer can plant barley at 4,000 meters today. That is not a metaphor. That is a functioning piece of biological equipment handed across species still in daily use. And it is not the only one. Other inherited fragments appear to influence immune function, and researchers have identified Denisovan-derived variants associated with body fat distribution and cold tolerance in populations at high latitudes. The pattern that emerges is consistent and I think rather elegant. Our ancestors walked into unfamiliar territory, and the people already there had spent hundreds of thousands of years being shaped by it. Instead of solving those problems from scratch over the many generations that natural selection ordinarily requires incoming populations, acquired ready-made solutions in a single generation by having children with the locals. There is a word for this in genetics: adaptive introgression, which is a fairly bloodless term for something that was in practice a series of individual human relationships. Now here's a question worth pausing on, and it is one researchers actually argue about. If a population interbreeds with us, and its genes are still circulating in people alive today, in what sense did it go extinct at all? Some argue the Denisovans did not disappear so much as get absorbed, their small numbers folded into a much larger incoming population. Others point out that absorption is still an ending. A distinct way of being human stopped existing whatever survived in fragments. Both are defensible. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility I find hardest to shake, our whole idea of separate human species is a filing system we imposed on something that was never that tidy in the first place. The cave itself provided one more piece of evidence, and the odds against it are almost comic. In 2018, researchers analysing a small bone fragment from the same site found something unprecedented. The individual had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, not a distant mixture several generations back, a first-generation child of two different human populations. The specimen was that of a young individual, and beyond the genetics, very little else about them can be established. Think about the probability. We have a handful of genetically sequenced individuals from this entire era worldwide, a tiny sample. And within that tiny sample, one of them is a direct child of two different groups. Statistically, that suggests such pairings were not the rare remarkable events we might assume. They may have been reasonably ordinary. Two populations sharing the same mountains, encountering each other, and doing what humans have always done when they meet, forming families. For roughly a decade, that was where things stood. Superb genetics, no faces. Then the fossils started arriving from unexpected directions. In 1980, a monk praying in a cave on the Tibetan plateau more than 3,000 meters above sea level found half a lower jaw with unusually large molars. He passed it to a local religious figure, and eventually it reached a university collection where it sat for years while nobody quite knew what to make of it. In 2019, a team analysed proteins preserved in the tooth dentine because the material was far too old and too poorly preserved for genetic analysis. Proteins survive longer than genetic material does. The protein signature matched Denisovans. The jaw is at least 160,000 years old, and it was found at high altitude, which fits rather beautifully with the oxygen gene story. That was the first Denisovan fossil identified outside Siberia. It was also the first time anyone had identified an ancient human population using proteins alone. And then there is the skull, which comes with the best discovery story in this entire field. In 1933, a labourer working on a bridge over a river in northeastern China unearthed a large, remarkably complete fossil human skull. The region was under Japanese occupation at the time. He decided, for reasons that are entirely understandable, that the occupying authorities were not going to have it. He took the skull home and hid it at the bottom of an abandoned well, and there it stayed. Through the war, through the occupation ending, through decades of political upheaval in which explaining where he had found it would have required explaining who he had been working for. He told nobody for 85 years. In 2018, near the end of his life, he finally told his family, who retrieved the skull and handed it to researchers. I should note that some scientists have questioned parts of that account and the details cannot be fully verified. But the skull is certainly real, and it is spectacular, massive, thick-browed, with a brain case in the modern range and a face unlike anything already named. In 2021, researchers proposed it as a new species entirely. Then in 2025, a team led by Qiaomei Fu tried something clever. Genetic material could not be recovered from the tooth or the dense bone of the inner ear. So they went after the hardened dental plaque instead, the calcified residue on the teeth, and from that they recovered mitochondrial genetic material. Alongside a separate study of proteins from the same skull, the answer came back Denisovan. 15 years after a chip of fingerbone announced that these people existed, they finally had a face. There was one more from an even stranger source, a fossil jaw dredged up by a fishing operation from the seafloor off the coast of Taiwan, from ground that was dry land during the ice ages, also turned out to carry Denisovan protein signatures when researchers examined it. which extends the known range of these people from the freezing mountains of Siberia across the Tibetan Plateau, through northeastern China, and down to what is now the tropical edge of the Pacific. That is an extraordinary spread of territory for a population we could not even describe 15 years ago. Cold mountains, thin air at extreme altitude, temperate river valleys, subtropical coast. Whatever else the Denisovans were, they were adaptable across a range of environments that would challenge almost any species. So here's where we stand tonight. A population named after a hermit's cave identified from a fragment described by proteins and plaque still circulating in the blood of millions of people and only recently given a skull to belong to. There's something in that worth carrying with you. The Denisovans were not hidden because they were rare. They were hidden because we did not have the tools to see them, and we assumed that what we could not detect did not exist. Every fossil collection in Asia may well contain Denisovan material sitting in a drawer under a different label, waiting for somebody to look again with better equipment. And if you've ever sent a saliva sample off in the post for one of those ancestry tests, you may have received a small percentage figure for archaic ancestry alongside the rest of your results, and scrolled past it without much thought. That number is the end of this story. It is a measurement of encounters between populations that happened tens of thousands of years ago, in places nobody recorded, between people whose names were never written down, and whose faces we're only now beginning to reconstruct. A line item on a chart generated by a laboratory, describing something that was once an ordinary afternoon in somebody's life, which raises an uncomfortable question about everything else we currently feel confident about. But while these populations were meeting and mixing across Asia, something was going badly wrong for their Western cousins. Neanderthal numbers were falling, and roughly 40,000 years ago, a mountain in southern Italy did something catastrophic at almost exactly the wrong moment. For years, that eruption was the prime suspect. There is a town on the Bay of Naples west of the city where roughly 500,000 people go about their ordinary days. They open shops, walk, their dogs argue about parking. The ground occasionally rises and falls beneath them by a few centimetres a year, and the locals have long since stopped finding this remarkable. They are standing inside a volcano, not beside one. Inside the collapsed crater of one, a caldera about 13 kilometres across called the Phlegraean Fields. And roughly 39 to 40,000 years ago, that caldera produced the largest volcanic eruption Europe has seen in the past 200,000 years. The technical name for what came out of it is the Campanian ignimbrite. Ash travelled thousands of kilometres, and geologists have identified its distinctive chemical fingerprint in sediment layers as far away as central Russia, where it settles neatly over archaeological sites like a marker laid down by the Earth itself. Sulfur dioxide went into the upper atmosphere. Temperatures across parts of Europe fell. The ash layer, by the way, is a strange gift to archaeology. Volcanic glass carries a chemical signature as specific as a serial number unique to the eruption that produced it. So when a researcher digging in Ukraine or Greece or the Russian plains finds a thin band of that particular glass in a trench wall, they know instantly that everything below it predates a single precise moment, and everything above it came after. A whole continent's worth of sites tied together by one bad afternoon in southern Italy. There is also a detail of timing that made the story even more compelling. The eruption coincided with the onset of a severe cold phase that climate scientists identify in North Atlantic sediment records, one of a series of episodes when armadas of icebergs poured off the northern ice sheets and chilled the ocean. Two catastrophes arriving together, and here is the detail that made this eruption irresistible to anyone telling the story of human evolution. It happened at almost precisely the moment the Neanderthals disappear from the record. You can see why the theory took hold, can't you? It has everything. A population under pressure hanging on in scattered pockets across Europe. A catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. A sudden cold snap. And then silence where a species used to be. It is the kind of tidy dramatic explanation that fits comfortably into a documentary, a headline, or the last chapter of a book. In 2010, researchers working in a cave in the Caucasus published findings supporting exactly this. They identified volcanic ash layers in the cave sediments and noted that Neanderthal occupation appeared to end around them. Volcanic winter, they argued, had finished off a population already struggling, so let's test it properly. Because this is one of my favourite examples of how science actually works, and it plays out almost exactly like a detective story, a suspect with motive opportunity and, as it turns out, an alibi. The first test came in 2015 when a team led by Benjamin Black ran the eruption through a sophisticated climate model, feeding in different estimates of how much sulfur dioxide the volcano released and simulating the resulting aerosol cloud under Ice Age conditions. The results were sobering in a completely unexpected direction. Yes, there was cooling. Western Europe would have experienced average temperature drops of somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius in the year following the eruption. That is significant, and it would have been miserable, and it would have affected plant growth, animal movement, and hunting. But the peak cooling lasted 1 to 2 years. Not decades, not a permanent shift. And crucially, the most intense cooling in their model did not fall on Western Europe at all, where most surviving Neanderthal populations were concentrated. It largely missed them. 2 to 4 degrees for a couple of years is a hard season. It is not an extinction event for a population that had already survived multiple full ice ages, glacial cycles that reshaped entire continents. These were people whose ancestors had endured hundreds of thousands of years of European winters. A cold snap, no matter how severe, does not obviously finish them. But the real problem for the volcano theory came from a completely different direction, and it involves the unglamorous, tedious, absolutely essential business of dating things accurately. Radiocarbon dating at 40,000 years is operating at the very edge of its useful range, and there's a nasty trap built into it. If a sample picks up even a tiny amount of modern carbon, from handling from preservatives applied by museum staff decades ago from groundwater, the result skews dramatically younger. Less than 1% modern contamination in a 40,000-year-old sample can make it appear thousands of years younger than it is, which means that for decades a great many dates for late Neanderthal sites were probably too young, not through anyone's fault. The methods for aggressively purifying samples before dating simply did not exist yet. When researchers went back and redated key sites in northwestern Europe, using improved purification techniques, the picture shifted. The revised figures place the disappearance of Neanderthals from that region somewhere between roughly 44,000 and 40,600 years ago. The eruption happened around 39,800 years ago. Do you see the problem? On the best current dating, the Neanderthals of northwestern Europe were already gone by something on the order of 1,000 years before the volcano ever erupted. The suspect has an alibi. He was demonstrably somewhere else when the crime occurred. The same improved dating work delivered a second finding worth noting. Modern humans turn out to have been in Europe earlier than anyone used to think. Sites in Bulgaria and Italy have produced evidence of our own species on the continent by around 45,000 years ago, and one rock shelter in southern France has yielded traces suggesting a brief modern human presence, considerably earlier still. Which means the two populations shared this continent not for a few dramatic centuries, but for thousands of years in overlapping and sometimes alternating occupations of the very same valleys. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this. Dating at these timescales carries real uncertainty and the ranges overlap in places. Some regional populations may have persisted later than others, and southern Europe is a more complicated picture than the northwest. There are researchers who still consider the eruption a meaningful contributing factor, particularly as one stress among several. But as the primary cause, the single dramatic event that ended a species, the case has largely collapsed. There is one further piece of evidence that seals it rather neatly. At sites where that volcanic ash band is present, archaeologists have looked at what happens immediately above it. If the eruption had emptied Europe, you would expect a long sterile gap in the layers, a stretch of years in which nobody was there. That is not what the trenches show. human occupation resumes above the ash in some places quite promptly. Whoever was in Europe when the sky filled with dust, they were still in Europe afterward, hunting and napping stone and getting on with it. So if it wasn't the volcano, what was it? Here's where the answer becomes both less satisfying and I think far more interesting. Start with a number that surprises nearly everyone. Genetic studies suggest the effective Neanderthal population across the whole of Europe and Western Asia was somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 individuals. Not 3,000 per region. 3,000 total for the entire species sustained at roughly that level for hundreds of thousands of years. Take that in for a second. An entire kind of human being spread across a continent and a half in numbers that would fit comfortably into a small town. In 2019, a team led by Chris Vazen took this seriously and did something clever. They built population models using data from present-day hunter-gatherer societies and ran simulations over a 10,000-year window, testing 3 factors that conservation biologists watch closely in endangered species today: inbreeding, random year-to-year fluctuations in births and deaths, and something called the allele effect. That last term deserves explaining because it is the quiet villain of this story. An allele effect is what happens when a population becomes so small that being small is itself the problem. Finding a mate takes longer. Cooperative hunting becomes harder with fewer capable adults. Losing 3 people to a bad winter, which a large group absorbs without noticing, can cripple a group of 20. Conservation biologists deal with this constantly in the present day, which is why the researchers borrowed their tools. It is the reason a rescue program for an endangered animal does not simply protect the last remaining individuals and hope. Below a certain threshold, protection is no longer enough, because the trouble is no longer coming from outside. The population starts failing at its own arithmetic. Births fall slightly short of deaths year after year for reasons no single observation would ever flag as alarming. The models produced an uncomfortable result. Small population size on its own was enough. Even assuming Neanderthals were identical to modern humans in intelligence, culture, and capability, and even with no competition from anyone at all, populations of that size faced a serious risk of simply fading out over 10,000 years. No villain required, no volcano, no massacre, no superior competitor, just arithmetic running quietly for a very long time. And then in 2024, a discovery in southern France added something truly startling to this picture. At a rock shelter overlooking the Rhone Valley, a team led by Ludovic Slimek recovered the remains of a late Neanderthal individual, an adult male nicknamed Thorin. When his genome was sequenced, it made no sense at first. It looked far older than the archaeological layer suggested, resembling Neanderthals from 100,000 years earlier. The explanation, once they worked it out, is remarkable. Thorin's population had been genetically isolated for around 50,000 years. No exchange of genes with other Neanderthal groups. None. And these were not distant neighbours. Other Neanderthal populations sat within what the researchers described as something like 10 days' walk. 50,000 years. 2 groups of the same species that near to each other and never once mixing. Slimak has made the point that this would be almost unthinkable for our own species. We are relentless travellers, traders, gossips, exchangers of tools and stories and marriage partners. Whatever else you might say about modern humans, we are terrible at leaving each other alone. So here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If 2 groups of people can share a landscape for 50 millennia without ever meeting in any meaningful way, what does that tell you about how they understood their world? And what does it cost a species over that kind of timescale to exist in small, sealed, self-contained pockets? The answer most likely is that it cost everything. Isolated groups do not share innovations. They cannot draw on outside partners when their own numbers dip. When a bad decade arrives, there is no wider network to fall back on. Each pocket rises and falls entirely on its own. Compare that with what the modern human arrivals were doing at the same time. Their sites show materials moving impressive distances, seashells hundreds of kilometers inland, particular types of fine stone carried far from where they outcrop, decorative beads of similar styles appearing across enormous stretches of territory. Those objects did not walk. They moved because people moved and traded and visited and married outward. Every one of those shells is a receipt for a relationship between groups. That is not a story about one species being cleverer than another. Two populations can be equally intelligent and equally skilled, and the one with a wider web of connections will absorb a bad winter that flattens the one without. The advantage was never in the individual skull, it was in the size of the net, which suggests the arrival of modern humans mattered, but perhaps not in the way we have traditionally imagined. Not necessarily as a conflict and not necessarily as a competition over resources. Possibly something quieter, incoming populations settling into landscapes and gradually reshaping who occupied which valleys, breaking already fragile groups into even smaller and more cut-off fragments, sometimes absorbing them as the genetic evidence we discussed earlier makes plain. And here is the thing about this that I keep returning to. We wanted a dramatic ending because we are storytelling animals, and stories want a final act with weather in it. A volcano and ice age a last stand. What the evidence actually describes is something far more ordinary and far sadder, a long, slow thinning out over thousands of years, in which nothing especially terrible happened on any particular day. There was no last Neanderthal standing on a hilltop watching smoke on the horizon. There were just fewer of them, and then a valley where nobody came back. Extinctions, it turns out, are mostly quiet. They are made of years in which not enough children are born and nobody notices because you cannot notice a thing that does not happen. Before we move on, let me bring you back to that bay near Naples for a moment because there is a loose thread there worth tying. The Phlegrean fields did not go anywhere. The caldera is still active, still monitored, constantly, still lifting and settling under those 500,000 people. In recent years, the ground movement and small earthquakes have picked up enough that scientists watch it very carefully indeed. Nobody's predicting a repeat of what happened 40,000 years ago. Eruptions on that scale are rare, almost beyond comprehension, and the volcano has produced far smaller events many times since. But it is a strange thought to hold on a quiet night that the single largest catastrophe in European prehistory sits under a neighbourhood where somebody is currently doing the washing up. And if the lesson of this chapter is that we should be careful about assigning blame to whatever dramatic thing happened nearby, there is a companion lesson in the fact that the dramatic thing is still there. We simply learned it was innocent of this particular charge. But their story does not end in silence, not entirely because something extraordinary was already underway elsewhere on the same continent. In caves in Germany and southern France, someone was carving figurines out of mammoth ivory, drilling finger holes into hollow bird bone to make instruments and painting animals on stone walls by firelight. For a long time, we called that moment a revolution. Some researchers now think it was nothing of the sort. September 2008. A cave called Hohlfels tucked into a river valley in the Swabian Jura of southwestern Germany. The name translates with characteristic German directness as hollow rock. A team from the University of Tübingen, directed by an archaeologist named Nicholas Conrad, has been working this cave for years. Their method is almost absurdly patient. They remove sediment in layers only a few centimeters thick, then wash and sift every scrap of it through fine mesh. Because the things they are hunting are small enough to vanish between somebody's fingers. On this particular dig, they recover 12 fragments of bone from a single small patch of ground. The bone came from the wing of a griffon vulture. Fitted back together, the pieces form a tube roughly 22 centimeters long, 8 millimeters across with 5 finger holes drilled along its length, and a carefully cut notch at one end where a player's lips would go. It is a musical instrument. It is around 40,000 years old. And when researchers made a faithful replica and someone played it, it turned out to produce a clear, recognizable range of notes, in a tonal arrangement a modern musician would find perfectly familiar. Let that settle for a moment. Somebody selected a bird bone specifically because it was naturally hollow. Somebody worked out where to place the holes to get the intervals they wanted, which is not a guess you get right by accident. And somebody in a freezing valley during an ice age sat in the firelight and played. The craftsmanship deserves attention too, because this was not a matter of poking holes in a bone. The instrument required the ends to be cut cleanly. The interior scraped smooth the notch shape precisely enough to split the airstream and make a note at all. Anyone who has tried to get a sound out of an unfamiliar instrument knows the first attempt usually produces nothing but breathing. Whoever made this had made others before it, or had been shown by somebody who had. And in fact, researchers working these valleys have now recovered fragments of a number of instruments, some of bird bone and some carved from mammoth ivory, which is a considerably harder problem since ivory is not hollow. It has to be split lengthwise, hollowed out, then rejoined and sealed airtight. Somebody looked at a solid tusk and thought I could make that sing. That is not a survival instinct, that is ambition. Here's the part that made the discovery even better. In the very same month, in the very same layer less than a metre away, the team recovered 9 fragments of mammoth ivory. Assembled, they form a small carved female figure about 6 centimetres tall, now known as the Venus of Hohle Fels. It is among the oldest depictions of the human form ever found. Music and sculpture side by side in the same handful of dirt. That small ivory figure has generated its own long argument incidentally. Female figures of this general kind turn up across Europe over a span of many thousands of years, with exaggerated proportions and often no facial detail at all. Interpretations have ranged from fertility symbols to representations of specific individuals to something more like self-portraits, and there is a fair case that a century of largely male archaeologists reached for the most obvious explanation faster than the evidence justified. The honest answer is that we are looking at objects whose meaning was carried entirely in a context that has not survived. Somebody knew exactly what that figure was for. Nobody alive does, and the region does not stop there. From a nearby cave came something even more startling, a standing figure carved from mammoth ivory 31 centimetres tall, with the body of a person and the head of a lion. It is called the Lion Man, and it is roughly 40,000 years old as well. That object deserves a moment of its own because of what it required. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to reproduce it using only the tools available at the time, stone blades against dense ivory, and their estimates run to something in the range of 400 hours of work. 400 hours! That is not something you carve in the gaps between meals. Somebody was fed while they did that. A group decided that this person's time was better spent making a lion-headed figure than gathering food, and everyone else covered the difference, which tells you something rather profound about the economics of that community before you even get to the question of what the figure meant. And the figure is not a lion, and it is not a person. It is both, which means it is neither, which means it is something that has never existed anywhere except inside somebody's head. Whoever carved that was not copying the world. They were copying an idea. The Lion Man has its own difficult history too. It was found in 1939 in hundreds of fragments, days before the outbreak of war in Europe forced the excavation to shut down. The pieces sat in a museum unrecognized and unassembled for about 30 years before anyone worked out what they had. Further fragments turned up in later decades, and the reconstruction has been revised more than once. It took the better part of 70 years for that figure to fully stand up again. Now, if you think those caves have finished giving things up, they have not. During the 2025 field season at Hohle Fels, the team recovered a pair of tiny bird figurines carved from mammoth ivory, along with fresh fragments of vulture bone instruments. One of the carvings was so small it was not even spotted in the trench. It was found in the laboratory afterward by a specialist examining sifted sediment for microscopic animal remains. Think about the implication of that. Nearly 30 years into excavating one cave and it is still producing masterpieces small enough to be mistaken for gravel. Because here is what all this accumulation actually means, and it took decades to sink in. These are not isolated flashes of genius. One carved figure is an anomaly. A cave system producing figurines of horses, waterfowl and otter, a small lion figure, a female form, multiple instruments made of bone and ivory all within a few valleys of each other is not an anomaly. It is a school, a tradition. People teaching other people how to do this and doing it for generations. Then, in 1994, 3 covers exploring a cliff face in southern France felt cold air coming out of a gap in the rubble. They cleared it, dropped down into darkness, and found themselves standing in a chamber whose walls were covered in animals. Chauvet Cave contains hundreds of paintings, some of them around 36,000 years old, and the sophistication is what stops people in their tracks. Artists scraped the walls clean first to brighten the surface. They used the natural contours of the rock to give bodies volume so that a bulge in the stone becomes the shoulder of a bison. They shaded with charcoal to suggest depth. In one famous panel, a group of lions is drawn with overlapping heads to create a sense of a pride moving together. This is not primitive work that we generously call art. This is work that any competent draftsman today would recognize as skilled. And consider the conditions. There is no daylight in those chambers, none at all, so every mark was made by the light of a fire or a burning wick held by someone or propped on a ledge flickering. Some of the panels are hundreds of meters from the entrance down passages that require crawling. There is no practical reason to go that deep. Nobody sleeps there. Nobody eats there. Somebody made a decision to travel into total darkness carrying light and pigment in order to put an animal on a wall where almost no one would ever see it. The floor of that cave also holds the tracks and scratch marks of cave bears animals that would have used the same chambers, which means those artists were working in a space they knew was not entirely theirs. So for most of the 20th century, all of this got bundled into a single tidy story. Something happened in Europe around 40 to 50,000 years ago. A switch flipped. Human beings anatomically modern for 100,000 years already suddenly became behaviorally modern. Art appeared. Music appeared. Complex tools, ornaments, ritual. Researchers called it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or the Human Revolution, and some proposed it reflected a genetic change, a rewiring of the brain, possibly the arrival of full language itself. It is a satisfying story. It has a beginning, a turning point, and a cast of European caves. Then in the year 2002, archaeologists named Sally McBurty and Alison Brooks published a lengthy and rather devastating paper with a title I have always admired, The Revolution That Wasn't. Their argument was blunt. The revolution was an illusion produced by looking at the wrong continent. Nearly every element of that supposedly sudden package they showed appears in the African archaeological record tens of thousands of years earlier and appears piecemeal at different sites at different times. Blade technology, bone tools, systematic processing of mineral pigment, specialized hunting, use of coastal and aquatic food sources, materials moving over long distances, deliberate decoration. Not a package, a slow accumulation spread across a continent and across 100,000 years or more. Evidence has kept arriving in their favour. From a cave on the South African coast, researchers have recovered pieces of red ochre, engraved with deliberate cross-hatched patterns, dating back somewhere in the region of 73 to 100,000 years, along with shell beads and a set of tools for processing pigment into a workable paste. That is symbolic behaviour tens of millennia before anyone in Europe drilled a hole in a vulture bone. There is more. Ostrich eggshell containers from another southern African site engraved with patterned bands appear in quantity across a span of thousands of years, and the patterns shift over time in a way that looks unmistakably like changing style. Style is a social phenomenon. It requires an audience that recognizes what is fashionable and what is old-fashioned. And further north in a basin in Kenya, archaeologists have documented pigment and obsidian moving distances of many tens of kilometers from sources far outside the local area in layers dating back hundreds of thousands of years. So why did the illusion persist for so long? Two reasons, and neither is flattering. The first is preservation and geography. European cave sites are magnificent for archaeology, stable, dry deep, and full of undisturbed layers. Much of the African record sits in open-air sites in climates that destroy organic material. If you carve an ivory figure in Germany, it may survive 40 millennia. Carve the same thing in wood on the East African coast and it is gone within a century. The second reason is simply where the archaeologists were. European prehistory was investigated intensively by well-funded institutions for 150 years before comparable work began at scale elsewhere. We found a revolution in Europe partly because Europe is where we spent the money digging. Have you noticed how often that turns out to be the answer in this field? Now I want to be fair because the debate is not settled and the gradualists have not simply won. Something does change in the record around 40,000 years ago. The density increases. The objects become more numerous, more standardized, more widely shared across regions. Defenders of a real transition argue that a slow accumulation of ingredients does not explain a sudden intensification, and that dismissing the change entirely goes too far in the other direction. Both sides are looking at real patterns. My own reading, for whatever it is worth, is that the capacity was ancient and the expression was situational. A single family isolated does not produce a school of ivory carving, no matter how clever they are. Put more people in contact with each other in denser networks with more exchange and more competition and more audience, and things that were always possible start becoming common, which means what changed may not have been the mind at all. It may have been the number of minds within reach of one another. There is a genetic footnote worth including here because it is often told badly. A gene called FOXP2, which is involved in the fine motor control underlying speech, was once described in the press as the language gene discovered after researchers studied a family with an inherited speech disorder. It is nothing so simple. And crucially, when researchers sequenced Neanderthal material, they found the same version of that gene our own species carries. Whatever it does, it was not the thing that separated us from them. So let me leave you with this before we move on. Somebody chose a vulture's wing bone because it was hollow. Somebody spent 400 hours making an animal that does not exist. Somebody crawled into a chamber with no daylight, carrying fire, and painted lions on a wall for an audience of almost nobody. None of that is survival. It is all in the strictest sense unnecessary, and it is the most recognizable thing in this entire story because it is what you are doing right now, listening to a voice tell you about people you will never meet for no practical reason whatsoever. There is one more small thing worth noticing, and it might be the strangest of all. That instrument from the cave produces intervals that a modern ear finds pleasant. Not alien, not arbitrary. Pleasant. Which suggests that whatever it is inside us that responds to certain arrangements of sound that quiet lift you feel when a piece of music resolves the way you hoped it would, was already fully installed 40,000 years ago and has not changed since. If you have music playing quietly somewhere tonight, or if you have ever had a song catch you off guard and put a lump in your throat, that response is not modern. It is not cultural training. It is a piece of equipment you inherited along with the thumb and the tailbone, and it was already being used for exactly this purpose by people sitting in a cold German valley while mammoths walked outside. That impulse is not new. It may be the oldest thing about us. And here is what makes the next stretch of this story so strange. You might assume that once our ancestors were carving ivory and painting caves, evolution had essentially finished with us. Body complete, mind complete, the rest is history and culture. It is not even slightly true. The changes since then have been faster, sharper, and stranger than almost anything that came before. Let me introduce you to a woman with a portable ultrasound machine and a boat. Her name is Melissa Ellardo, and around 2015 she was a doctoral student with an idea that her supervisors, by her own account, tried gently to talk her out of. She wanted to travel to a village in Indonesia and scan people's spleens. Not the most obvious research proposal. Let me explain why it was brilliant. The people she wanted to study are called the Bajau, sometimes described as sea nomads, and they have followed a maritime way of existence in the waters around Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines for well over 1,000 years. A chronicler on one of Magellan's voyages made note of them in 1521. Traditionally, they spent much of their time on boats, taking most of their food from the water beneath them, and they dive, not recreationally, professionally all day with nothing but a set of weights and a pair of hand-carved wooden goggles. Some Bajau divers spend as much as 60% of a working day underwater, descending to depths approaching 70 meters hunting fish and octopus with a spear. One diver told Ilado he had once held a single breath for 13 minutes. Now why the spleen? Because in diving mammals, the spleen behaves like a reserve oxygen tank. When a body is submerged in cold water, a set of automatic responses kicks in. The heart rate slows blood vessels in the limbs, narrow, and the spleen contracts, squeezing a supply of oxygen-rich red blood cells into circulation. Deep-diving seals have disproportionately enormous spleens. Ilado's hunch was that if evolution had done anything to the Bajau, it might have done it there. She spent months in a village called Jaya Bhakti, taking genetic samples and running ultrasound scans on Bajau participants, and on their neighbours, a neighbouring group whose days are spent on land. I want you to picture the practical reality of that fieldwork for a moment, because it is not the version of science that appears in documentaries. A young researcher, far from any laboratory, carrying a portable scanner into people's homes, explaining in a second language why she would like to look at their internal organs and asking politely whether they might sit still for a few minutes, then doing it again and again, building trust in a community that had no particular reason to care about her thesis. The results, published in 2018, were remarkable. The median Bajau spleen was about 50% larger, but here is the detail that turned it from an interesting observation into evidence of evolution. The enlarged spleens showed up in Bajau individuals who did not dive at all. If diving itself were simply building the organ like exercise builds a muscle non-diverse would look like everybody else. They did not. The trait was inherited, not trained. Researchers connected it to a genetic variant linked to thyroid hormone regulation, which in laboratory studies is associated with spleen size. A second variant appeared to relate to how blood vessels in the extremities constrict during a dive, preserving oxygen for the organs that need it most. So here's what that means. Within roughly 1,000 years or so, a human population bound in a particular relationship with the sea has been measurably reshaped by it internally in the organs. Which brings us to the question this part of our story exists to answer. Did human evolution stop? Ask most people and they will say something reasonable and wrong. That we escaped natural selection when we invented agriculture or medicine or central heating. That culture replaced biology as the thing that adapts. It is a comforting idea, and it collapses the moment you look at the evidence. Because not only did evolution continue, it appears to have accelerated. And the reason is almost embarrassingly simple. Mutations arise at a roughly steady rate per person, so the more people there are, the more raw variation appears for selection to work on. Agriculture produced vastly more people. It also produced crowding new diets, new animals kept alongside us, and a spectacular quantity of new diseases. More variation, and much stronger pressure arriving at the same time. There is a neat irony buried in this. The very inventions that people point to as proof that we escaped natural selection are the things that intensified it. Farming did not release us from evolutionary pressure. It invented several new kinds. Every technology that changed how we ate, where we slept, and how densely we packed together, handed selection a fresh set of instructions. Culture, it turns out, does not replace biology. It writes biology's exam questions. Let me give you the best documented example, and I promise there is a genuine surprise in it. Roughly 2/3 of adults in the world today cannot comfortably digest large quantities of fresh milk. That is the normal human condition. The enzyme that breaks down milk sugar switches off after infancy in most mammals, because most mammals have no use for it after weaning. What needs explaining is not intolerance. It is the minority who keep the enzyme running for life. That trait called lactase persistence spread through parts of Europe with astonishing speed. It is one of the strongest signals of recent natural selection anywhere in the human genome. And the textbook explanation was always beautifully obvious. Farmers had dairy animals. Milk is nutritious. People who could drink it thrived. In 2022, a very large study demolished that explanation. A team led by Richard Evershed at Bristol assembled a database of nearly 7,000 animal fat residues extracted from more than 13,000 fragments of ancient pottery from 554 archaeological sites. That is an extraordinary amount of unglamorous laboratory work, and it produced a clean map of who was processing milk, where and when across 9,000 years. Meanwhile, a team at University College London led by Mark Thomas built a parallel database tracking the genetic variant itself through ancient remains. Lay the two maps on top of each other, and the obvious story falls apart. Europeans were using milk extensively for thousands of years while almost nobody could digest lactose as an adult. And the regions with the heaviest milk use were not the regions where the genetic variant spread fastest. So what was driving it? Their answer is grim and I think quietly fascinating. If you are healthy and cannot digest lactose well, drinking milk gives you an uncomfortable afternoon. Nothing more. But if you are severely malnourished during a famine, or already suffering from an illness causing fluid loss, the additional strain from undigested milk sugar becomes dangerous rather than merely unpleasant. What their models found was that measures of population instability, settlement density, and famine risk explain the spread of the variant far better than the amount of milk being consumed did. In other words, this trait did not spread because milk was good for people in ordinary times. It spread because in the worst of times, during famine and epidemic, the small percentage of people carrying it were more likely to survive to have children. The gene was selected in the disasters, not in the good years. Have you ever considered that some of the traits we carry today were shaped less by what helped our ancestors flourish, and more by what they happened to survive? That principle turns up again and again once you start looking for it, nowhere more clearly than in the long argument between human bodies and the things that infect them. Consider what farming actually did to us biologically. Settled communities meant people packed together in numbers that hunting and gathering never sustained. It meant animals in the yard and their illnesses learning to jump species. It meant standing water-stored grain and rodents. Almost every infectious disease that has shaped human history arrived on the back of that transition, or was massively amplified by it. And the human genome carries the receipts. Variants associated with resistance to particular infections show up in exactly the regions where those infections were historically most dangerous, and often at frequencies that only intense selection can explain. In some cases, the cost is written into the same trait. Certain protective variants come with real health consequences when inherited from both parents, which is a brutal piece of arithmetic. A trait that harms some carriers can still spread if the alternative kills more people faster. That is not a comfortable way for a body to be built. Evolution does not optimize, it settles. Now let me show you something else which I find quietly elegant. Two populations, two continents, one identical problem, thin air at extreme altitude. We touched earlier on the Tibetan plateau where an inherited variant allows people to function at 4,000 meters without the dangerous blood thickening that afflicts visitors. Tibetan highlanders characteristically carry hemoglobin concentrations comparable to people at sea level. Their solution essentially is efficiency. Now travel to the Andes where populations have occupied high country for a considerably shorter span, roughly 10,000 years rather than tens of thousands. Andean highlanders solved it the other way around. They tend toward elevated hemoglobin concentrations, carrying more oxygen per unit of blood rather than using oxygen more efficiently. And when researchers went looking for the genetic signals, they found variation in some of the same genes involved in oxygen sensing, but different variants doing different things. Same problem. Same molecular machinery available, Two completely different solutions arrived at independently on opposite sides of the planet, and there is a third. Highland populations in Ethiopia have occupied elevated country for a very long time as well, and they manage the same challenge through yet another physiological arrangement, one that does not neatly match either the Tibetan or the Andean pattern. Three groups of people, three different answers to a problem set by nothing more complicated than the weight of the atmosphere. Notice the timescales too, because they matter. The Andean adaptation has developed within something like 10,000 years. That is not deep time. That is roughly the span between the first farming villages and the present day, and within it a human population has measurably rebuilt how its blood carries oxygen. That is what evolution actually looks like when you watch it work. Not a march toward a single correct answer, but a tinkerer with a limited toolkit improvising something workable out of whatever is lying around. And if you want proof that this is still happening right now in bodies alive today, consider your own forearm. While a fetus develops a vessel called the median artery, supplies blood to the developing forearm and hand. In most people, it regresses around the 8th week of gestation, replaced by two other arteries that carry the job into adulthood. That has been the standard description in anatomy textbooks for generations, except it is becoming less true. Researchers examining anatomical records and cadaver studies spanning well over a century found that persistence of that artery into adulthood has been rising steadily, somewhere around 10% in people born in the 1880s, and something in the region of 30% or more among people born in the later 20th century. Roughly 1 in 3 adults now carries an extra artery in each forearm that their great-great-grandparents mostly did not have. Some researchers project that if the trend continues, it could become the majority condition within this century. Meanwhile, in the other direction, a rising number of people are simply never developing wisdom teeth at all, which those of us who have had them removed may consider a rather generous gift from the future. There is a certain comedy in the two trends running side by side. Somewhere out there, the human body is quietly adding a spare artery to the forearm while simultaneously deleting a set of molars that has caused misery for as long as anyone has kept dental records. Nobody planned either change, nobody voted on it. It is simply what happens when a population keeps reproducing under conditions that differ even slightly from the ones its ancestors met. Nobody's entirely certain what is driving either trend. Reduced selection pressure, shifts in developmental timing and other factors are all under discussion, and it remains an open scientific conversation rather than a settled one. But the basic point stands, and it is worth holding on to tonight. Your anatomy is not a finished object handed down unchanged from the Ice Age. It is a snapshot of a process still in motion, and the version of the human body being assembled right now in delivery rooms across the world is in small measurable ways not quite the version that came before. Before we go further, there is something important to say plainly, because this is territory where careless thinking has done enormous historical damage. Everything we have discussed here concerns specific traits responding to specific local conditions. A spleen, an enzyme, a blood vessel. These are narrow adaptations to narrow problems, and they tell you nothing whatsoever about the worth, ability, or character of the people who carry them. The overwhelming majority of human genetic variation exists within any given population, rather than between populations, which means the person standing beside you may well differ from you more than a stranger on another continent does. The 19th century got this catastrophically wrong, dressed its prejudices in scientific language, and caused suffering on a scale that is still being reckoned with. What the actual evidence describes is not a ranking. It is a species that spread into every environment on the planet and got quietly, locally, modestly adjusted by each one, while remaining so genetically similar throughout that we would struggle to sort ourselves into meaningful biological categories if we tried. We are by the standards of most widespread species remarkably uniform. What variation we do carry is a record of places our ancestors happen to be not scoreboard. You are not the end of this story. You are the middle of it, which is a much more interesting place to be. And that raises the last question, the one this whole long journey has been walking toward. 7 million years of change of branches and dead ends and cousins we never knew we had. What did all of it actually leave inside you? More than you would guess. And a great deal of it is with you at this exact moment quietly doing its work while you lie there. So here we are at the end of a very long walk, 7 million years give or take compressed into one evening. And if you have stayed with me through all of it, I would like to spend these last minutes doing something slightly different. No new caves, no new arguments between scientists, just an inventory of you lying there right now. Because everything we have talked about tonight is not in a museum. Most of it is in the room with you. Start with your hand resting wherever it happens to be. That thumb folding easily to meet each fingertip came out of a forest that no longer exists, built originally for holding branches. It was already old when somebody first used it to strike one stone against another and produce an edge sharp enough to cut hide. Every tool anyone has ever made passed through a hand shaped like yours. Move down to the base of your spine. The small triangle of fused bone there is the remains of a tail your ancestors stopped needing before any of tonight's story properly began. It has no job now. It simply stayed. Somewhere at the back of your jaw you may have wisdom teeth, or you may have had them taken out, or you may be among the growing number of people who never grew them at all. Whichever it is, that crowded jaw is a record of a face that got smaller as food got softer, and a set of instructions that has not quite caught up. Your legs are long and your hips are narrow, which is a walking machine rather than a climbing one, assembled roughly 2 million years ago by creatures who used it to cross continents on foot, without maps, without roads, and without any idea what lay ahead of them. You cool yourself by sweating rather than panting, which is why a human being can keep moving through the heat of the day when almost nothing else can. Run a hand along the inside of your forearm if you like. There may be an extra artery in there that your great-grandparents mostly did not have added in the last 140 years by a process nobody planned and nobody controls. And if a piece of music has ever caught you off guard, if a chord has ever landed somewhere behind your ribs and made your eyes sting for no reason, you could explain that response is not modern either. Somebody was already using it deliberately in a freezing German valley 40,000 years ago on an instrument made from a bird's wing. And somewhere in the region of 1 to 2% of your genetic material, if your ancestry runs through Europe or Asia, came from people we spent a century and a half calling brutes. If your family line runs through the islands of Southeast Asia or Oceania, several percent of it came from a population we did not even know existed until a fragment of finger bone turned up in a Siberian cave. You're quite literally a composite, not a pure line, a mixture assembled from encounters between different kinds of human beings, most of which nobody recorded and none of which anyone expected us to be able to detect. Let me lay the whole shape of it out once quickly, because I think it is worth seeing in a single piece. Around 7 million years ago in African forest, a population split in two. One branch became chimpanzees and bonobos. The other became everything that leads to you, and the two have been changing at exactly the same rate ever since. Neither is the older model. Somewhere after that our side came down out of the trees and stood up and the hands went free. By 3.5 million years ago something was striking stone against stone deliberately enough to leave sharp edges, and by 1.5 million hominins were producing a teardrop-shaped tool so consistently across such a vast territory that the design barely changed for 1 million years. That is not instinct. That is teaching. Around 2 million years ago, one of those populations walked out of Africa entirely, reached the edge of the Pacific on foot. Crossed water nobody can fully explain and outlasted our own species so far by a factor of 5. By 400,000 years ago in northern Spain, somebody was carrying their dead into darkness. By 40,000, someone in a German valley was carving a lion-headed figure and someone else was making an instrument. Meanwhile, on an island east of Java, a human population had grown small and stayed small and thrived for 700,000 years. In the caves of Europe, another was making glue by controlled chemistry and painting walls with pigment. In the mountains of Asia, a third left almost no bones at all, and yet handed us working genes we use to this day. And then one by one they ended. not in a single catastrophe. Quietly in small numbers over long stretches of time in valleys where fewer people were born each generation than the one before, all of them except us. Now let me tell you what I find most staggering about all of this, and it is not any single fossil. It is the chain. Think about what had to happen for you to exist. Every single one of your ancestors, without one exception, going back 7 million years, survived long enough to reproduce. Not one link broke. Not one. Through the drying of African forests, through the volcanic ash and the shifting lakes, through ice ages that emptied whole continents, through famines, through illnesses that had no names, through every ordinary bad winter that killed the person sleeping next to them. Somebody in your direct line was there each time and made it through and had a child. The odds against any particular person existing are so enormous that the mathematics stops meaning very much. And yet here you are, warm and breathing, listening to a voice in a dark room. That is not a small thing. It might be the least small thing there is. And every one of those ancestors all the way back was a whole person to themselves. They had a favourite place to sit. They had somebody whose voice they recognised across a clearing. They had a day that went badly and a night they could not sleep. None of that survives. Only the outcome does, which is you. And it is worth being honest about what that chain is not. It is not a story of the best surviving. Plenty of your ancestors were not the strongest or the cleverest in their group. They were the ones who happened to be standing somewhere else when things went wrong. Survival across that kind of timescale is mostly luck wearing the costume of merit. We tell it as a tale of triumph, because we are the ones left to tell it. The branches that ended did not get to write anything down. Which brings me back to the cousins. I keep thinking about the people in that pit of bones in northern Spain carrying their dead through hundreds of meters of darkness for reasons we cannot recover and leaving one beautiful stone behind. About the small people on their island who solved their particular problem so well, they held on for 700,000 years. About the group in southern France that spent 50 millennia within 10 days' walk of their neighbours and never once mixed with them. None of them were failures. Every one of them was a complete way of being human tested against a real world, and every one of them worked for a very long time before it stopped working. We are simply the branch that has not stopped yet. There is a habit of mind this whole journey should probably cure us of, and I want to name it plainly before we finish, because it has shown up in almost every chapter tonight. Look at the pattern. Respected scientists believed a forged English skull for 40 years because it told them what they hoped to hear. A brilliant anatomist described Neanderthals as stooping brutes, and the world drew cartoons of it for half a century. A tiny skeleton on an island was dismissed as a sick individual because it did not fit the expected shape of the family tree. A volcano was blamed for an extinction it did not cause because the timing was dramatic and the story was satisfying. An entire population of humans went undetected across the whole of Asia because we didn't yet have the tools to see them and assumed that meant they were not there. Every single one of those errors was corrected, not by better people, by better methods and by somebody eventually going back to look again with fresh eyes and better equipment. And notice who did the correcting, because it is rarely who you would expect. A school teacher with no university position who looked properly at bones a quarry crew had nearly thrown away. A researcher whose early work was ruined by contamination, and who spent 30 years building the clean rooms that made the whole field possible. A chemist testing fluorine levels in a museum basement. 2 anatomists in the 1950s who simply went back and re-examined a skeleton everyone thought was settled. Field teams sifting cave sediment through fine mesh, season after season for decades for the sake of an object the size of a thumbnail. Almost none of it looked dramatic while it was happening. Most of it looked like paperwork. That to me is the real inheritance in this story, and it is not anatomical. It is the willingness to say I was wrong here. Is the evidence let us start again. That capacity is rare, it is difficult, and it is the only reason we know any of what we discussed tonight, which also means that some of what I've told you this evening will turn out to be wrong. I want to say that plainly rather than pretend otherwise. A decade ago, nobody had a Denisovan skull. 2 decades ago, the small people of that Indonesian island were not in any textbook. The dates for when our own species arrived in Europe have moved twice in recent years. Techniques that did not exist 5 years ago are now pulling genetic material out of hardened plaque on ancient teeth, and out of the dirt on cave floors where no bones survive at all. Somewhere right now in a museum drawer there is a fossil catalogued under the wrong name, waiting for a method that has not been invented yet. Somewhere there is a valley nobody has dug. The version of this story that gets told in 20 years will have chapters in it that no one alive can currently guess. I find that thrilling rather than frustrating, and I hope you do too. A field that never revises itself is not studying anything, it is just repeating. Now here is the part I have been saving. Everything we have covered, the tools and the migrations and the family tree, describe survival. But there is one thread running through this that has nothing to do with survival at all, and it is the thread I would like you to carry off to sleep. Somebody carried a beautiful reddish hand axe into total darkness and left it with people who could no longer use it. Somebody spent 400 hours carving a creature that has never existed anywhere except inside a human mind. Somebody chose a vulture's wing bone because it was hollow worked out where the holes should go and made music. Somebody crawled into a cave with no daylight, carrying fire, and painted lions on a wall for an audience of almost nobody at all. None of that fed anyone. None of it kept anyone warm. All of it cost time and effort that could have gone into something practical. And every one of those people did it anyway because something in them needed to make a mark or make a sound or mark a loss with more than silence. That impulse is not a modern luxury. It is not a product of comfort or civilization or leisure. It was there in the ice and the cold in years that were short and difficult, and it is the single most recognizable thing across all 7 million years. And you have it. It is why you find a piece of music beautiful. It is why you keep an object that belonged to someone you loved. It is why you are lying in the dark listening to a stranger tell you about people you will never meet for absolutely no practical reason whatsoever. You inherited that. It is with you tonight exactly as it was with them. So let me leave you with the thought I keep returning to when I look at all of this. We did not arrive at the top of anything. There is no top. There is a bush wildly branched, mostly ended, and we are one twig on it that is still green, carrying the borrowed genes of relatives we outlived and the unfinished bodies of ancestors who never knew we were coming. Your forearm may be growing an extra artery. Your jaw is still shrinking. Somewhere a population is adapting to something none of us have noticed yet. The story didn't stop with us. It is not going to, which means the most accurate thing anyone can say about human evolution is also the gentlest. It is not finished, and neither are you. Thank you for spending this time with me. It means more than you might think to know that somewhere out there in a quiet room, someone chose to spend a few hours of their life listening to the story of where we came from. I hope some of it stays with you. Perhaps the woman with the ultrasound machine, or the school teacher who recognized a skull nobody else did, or the man who hid a fossil in a well and kept the secret for 85 years. Perhaps just the sound of a flute made from a bird's wing 40,000 years ago in a cold valley by firelight. Rest now. Let the day go. There's another story waiting, and I will be here with it when you're ready. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and good night.